Denton's Bride. Book 1 of the Runaway Brides series. Written by Marie Higgins. Text copyright 2020 by Marie Higgins. Production copyright 2023 by Marie Higgins. 1. Montana, 1877. Never in Courtney Mills' life did she think she would be planning a wedding only to see her intended, lying on the floor, dead. Arranged marriages to old men needed to be outlawed. Courtney Mills twisted her handkerchief against her middle as she stared at the lifeless body of Albert Greenwood, the man 10 years older than her father, lying on the floor of his study. Blood stained the beige rug under his head as he lay face down. Next to his head was a marbled bust of George Washington. In Albert's study was his collection of history, and from the looks of it, George Washington was the very thing that probably ended Albert's life. Her stomach lurched, and she turned away, lifting her handkerchief to her mouth, inhaling the scented cloth slowly. Although she detested her parents selling her to Albert Greenwood to keep the money flowing between the two wealthy families, she didn't want the old man dead. After the initial shock of walking into the room and seeing him on the floor murdered, Courtney's body shook violently. Her mind clouded with confusion and mixed emotions. Part of her wanted to be relieved that she wasn't going to get married today, and yet, from what she could tell, someone had wanted him out of their lives, too. They'll blame me. Her throat constricted as panic welled within her. Albert's family, 3 sons, and 2 daughters, who were all older than Courtney, hadn't wanted their father to marry her. It didn't matter that she agreed with them, she had to obey her parents and marry the older man. His children hated her, no matter how nice she tried to be to them. The rhythm of her heartbeat accelerated, and her head throbbed with indecision. She should alert one of Albert's servants about his demise, and yet, she hesitated. Since she was the first to find him, she'd be their main suspect. She'd read mystery novels before. She knew how the law worked. She also knew that they would consider her guilty until she proved herself innocent. At this moment, she didn't know how that would ever happen. On unsteady legs, she slowly moved toward the door. She must leave. Now. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The butler was the only person to see her this morning since he had let her inside the house. Her parents hadn't arrived yet, and she must leave before anyone else noticed her presence. The fewer people who could testify that she was here, the better her chances were of not being hanged for a crime she hadn't committed. Instead of heading out the front door, she turned the other way and hurried toward one of the side doors down a back hallway. Voices were heard from somewhere in the house, but she couldn't tell who it was or where they were. Dizziness assailed her, and she bumped her shoulder against the wall. A picture that had been hanging fell to the floor. The wooden frame broke into several pieces. She couldn't stop. Freedom was what she needed. Her head filled with fog, and it seemed the door that would lead to her escape was so far ahead as if she were entering a tunnel. Courtney continued, placing one foot in front of the other. I can do this. I must do this. Finally, she reached the door and turned the knob. 2 steps later, she was outside. Inhaling deeply, she tried to clear her head. She needed to be alert to get away. But where would she go? Returning home to Butte was out of the question. That would be the first place the sheriff looked. Courtney took cautious steps around the house, staying as close to the red brick as she possibly could. As she passed behind tall bushes, the twigs pulled strands of hair out of the coil her maid had wrapped the bulk of her hair into. Courtney didn't care. Her main focus was to leave without being spotted. The stables, just down the slope, had some servants moving around inside. She stopped and held her breath. From her viewpoint, she didn't know if they noticed her or not. She couldn't let them see her at all. Moving slower now, she kept an eye on the stables, wondering if anyone would come out to see to her needs. She prayed they didn't. As she reached the front of the house, she realized her buggy was still out front with her luggage tied to the back, and she expelled a relieved sigh. Everything she owned was in those 3 trunks. She could leave Helena and never return. Tears stung her eyes as Courtney made the decision. She'd leave her family, her friends, and all those things she held dear to her heart. Then again, she would have had to do that after she married Albert, anyway. However, this time, there was no other choice but to follow the road and let it take her far away from here. She glanced around the yard, making sure nobody saw her, and darted toward her buggy. Just before reaching the vehicle, a terrified scream ripped through the air, coming from inside the mansion. Inwardly, Courtney groaned. One of the servants had found Albert. She wouldn't find a better time than now to make a run for it. The servants would be rushing inside the house to see where the scream had come from. Courtney couldn't wait a moment longer. She dashed toward her buggy and climbed inside. The hem of her dress caught on the step and ripped. A ruined dress didn't matter to her at the moment, and she grabbed the reins and whipped them in the air, urging her horse forward. Instead of taking the main road, she went off the trail and into the woods, following other paths. She couldn't go as fast as she wanted, but she tried to get out of this area as quickly as she could. People would be looking for her very soon. The image of Albert's wrinkled, palish gray face popped into her mind again. Her stomach lurched just like before. The old codger didn't deserve to die. Even though the idea of marriage to him made her physically ill, he still had a good 10 or 20 years left to live. Several hours passed, and thankfully, nobody followed her. As she took in her surroundings, she couldn't place where she was. Her hands ached from gripping the reins so tightly, but her heart wrenched in agony. Fear was still the underlying emotion in her gut, but it also was the very thing that kept her moving. Up ahead, she noticed a town. She would have to find something to eat before continuing on her journey. That would be the only way for her to keep going forward. As soon as she saw people moving in the street, she slowed down her horse and straightened her shoulders. She mustn't look like she was running away. Instead, she must appear that driving her buggy was normal and that she was going to visit a friend. A few people glanced her way, but thankfully, nobody knew her, nor did they question her motivation. As she approached the town hall, she noticed a little wagon out front with a canopy over a table that sat on the side. Written across a thick board were the words, "Mail-order brides." Courtney had read ads in the newspaper about ranchers looking for brides. She felt sorry for the woman who had to sink to such pitiful circumstances. It was difficult to imagine what a woman would have to suffer through in order to decide to marry someone they'd never met before. The man standing by the table, dressed as a preacher in his long black robes as he held a Bible, looked up at her. His gaze swept over her once before he smiled widely. "Pardon me, miss." He moved in front of the horse, stopping her progress. "Do you believe in guardian angels?" Irritation grew over her. This wasn't the time to talk about heaven. "Yes, but please, sir, I need you to move." As he stepped closer, he petted the horse. "Because I believe your guardian angel has led you to me." He pointed to his wagon. "You appear to be down on your luck, so let me tell you how to find your future. I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine." "But you're not fine." He moved closer as his gaze shifted to her messy hair, and then down to the bottom of her ripped gown that was still hooked on the step. "You look like a woman who needs help." "I don't," she snapped. "Please, just move aside so that I can pass." She didn't want to cause a commotion here in the road, only because if the sheriff came looking for her, he'd ask the people in this town, and she didn't want anyone to remember her. "Miss, please consider being a mail-order bride. I have a list of men looking for someone to manage their homes and be mothers to their children. These men need good, upstanding women like yourself." Although she didn't want to give in, this might be the only way to make this man leave her alone. Of course, signing up didn't mean she actually had to go through with it. "Fine, what do I need to do?" The middle-aged preacher grinned and motioned toward his tent. "If you could come over here, I'll show you what needs to be done." He helped guide the horse closer to his wagon and then assisted her as she climbed down. The preacher even removed the ripped hem of her dress from the step. Courtney pulled her arm away from him once she could stand on her own, and she walked to the table with him. A ledger was unfolded in front of her with many names and locations. "All of these men are looking for a bride?" she questioned. "Indeed, miss. They are praying for kind women like yourself to help them in their time of need." He pointed to one of the lines. "Just write your name next to the man you want, and then you send him a telegram to let him know you are interested in being his bride." The preacher shrugged. It's really that easy. She took a pencil and wrote Courtney before realizing she shouldn't reveal her true name. She quickly wrote Parker as her surname, since that was her mother's maiden name, and the only one she could think of right away. Splendid, the preacher said as he wrote on another piece of paper the name and location of the man who was looking for a bride. Now, take this and send him a telegram. She took the paper from him, hating that she had to do this. I must say, Mr. Timothy Graham is a very lucky man. Courtney nodded and turned back to her buggy. As she climbed back up to the seat, the preacher said the words, God bless you, and drew a cross in the air. Her heart clenched. Was God really blessing her? Or was he disappointed in her for not staying and trying to make Albert Greenwood's family and servants believe that she was innocent? She gripped the reins and urged the horse away from the wagon. Her weary mind spun with alternative plans. She was on the run, and yet, wasn't the best place to hide being married as a mail-order bride? Surely, the sheriff wouldn't think to look there. But no. Courtney wouldn't sink to marrying a stranger. It was almost as bad as marrying an older man that was closer to her grandfather's age than her father's. There must be other ways to be on the run and start a new life. Making a hasty decision right now would ruin her life completely. She must take a few days and think about the consequences first, and pray that the Lord would lead her in the right direction. 2. Denton Reed just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Slowly, he circled the dead man lying face down on the floor with his left hand lifted toward his face. The dead man's chair behind his desk had been overturned, but by the way his body lay on the floor, Denton didn't believe the man had been struck in the head with a marble bust of George Washington while sitting and had tumbled to the ground, as the sheriff had surmised. Denton's gut told him that the old man had been standing. Perhaps he'd been arguing with someone who was in a rage. Papers were scattered haphazardly over the desk. Even the man's coffee cup tipped over, staining several pages. Out of curiosity, Denton picked up the now empty cup and sniffed. The only scent he detected was coffee beans. He glanced at his friend, Terence Greenwood, the dead man's youngest son, who'd been Denton's friend for a few years. Terence was the reason Denton was in Helena, Montana, in the first place. His last case had ended him nearby, and he decided this was a good time to visit. Ever since he changed his occupation from sheriff's deputy to bounty hunter 5 years ago, luck had been following him wherever he went. Either that or he was really good at finding people who were hiding from the law. The undertaker was already at the scene. Once the sheriff and Denton had finished inspecting the body, the undertaker covered it with a white cloth and prepared it to take to the wagon out front of the manor. Denton retraced his steps around the study, searching for any clues. He'd heard whispers from a few servants and from the 3 Greenwood heirs who had gathered together. They spoke of their father's young fiancé, who was suspiciously missing, in bitter tones. He glanced at his friend. Terence, a tall, muscular man, held his trembling sister, stroking her dark red hair as she cried against his chest. His blank, watery stare was on the covering over his father. After a few moments, his gaze flew to Denton and he shook his head. Why would she do that to him? Terence's voice broke as more tears came. By marrying my father, Miss Mills would have been a very wealthy woman. Denton turned away from his friend to study the open window. A small breeze blew inside the room, but the window didn't appear to have scuff marks around it, and the glass didn't have any scratches or chips to make him think that someone crept in through the window. He looked at Albert Greenwood's children that were here. Terence was the youngest son, and the brother just older, Clive, sat on a leather sofa with his hands covering his face as his elbows rested on his knees while the sheriff asked him questions. Patricia, the oldest daughter, along with the oldest son, Wallace, lived in California, so they wouldn't be here anytime soon. Louise was the Greenwood daughter in Terence's arms. All the siblings shared their father's red hair. The Greenwood children were wealthy in their own right, thanks to their father's help. And Denton was certain that the man's death would give the children even more money to invest. None of them had a motive to want their father dead, mainly because they all had money. Miss Mills' motivation, however, he couldn't wrap his mind around. Terry, Denton said, stepping closer to his friend. Why does everyone think that your father's fiancé is at fault? Louise pulled out of Terrence's arms and glared at Denton. Her red face clashed with her auburn hair. You must be joking, Detective Reed. Courtney Mills had all the reason in the world to want father dead. Please explain. Denton wanted to hear how the family felt before he gave them his observation. Nodding, Terrence patted his sister's shoulder and gave her a comforting look. I'll tell him. Go sit by Clive. Louise threw another scowl at Denton before she hurried to her older brother. Terrence motioned Denton to the other side of the room. You see, Terrence began, father is friends with Miss Mills' father, and they arranged the marriage against the wishes of his children and the bride-to-be. He folded his arms and leaned his shoulder against the wall. From the first day we all met Miss Mills, we could tell she wasn't very happy with her future husband. Of course, she's so much younger than father. She's even younger than Louise. I'm sure Miss Mills loathed the idea of marrying someone so much older. Denton almost felt sorry for Miss Mills. No woman should have to suffer through an unwanted arranged marriage. I understand, however, if she truly wanted your father dead, wouldn't she have killed him after the wedding since she would have inherited your father's money? But since they aren't married, she gets nothing. Terrence's expression turned dark. Miss Mills has money, maybe not as much as my father, but she still has money. Just ask her parents. He pointed toward the hallway. Denton glanced out the study's door and noticed a middle-aged couple sitting on a bench in the spacious hallway. The man sat straight, wearing a stern expression. His wife dabbed her moist eyes with a handkerchief. They are the girl's parents? What are they doing here? Today was when father and Miss Mills were getting married. Miss Mills had planned to arrive early to have the servants take her trunks up to her room. She also needed help getting her hair fixed and dressed. Did anyone see her this morning? Denton asked, still keeping an eye on the upset parents. Mrs. Mills was quite lovely, even though she had a pale, teary face. The woman's hair was dark blonde and curly. The man's hair was brown and didn't really have any striking qualities that Denton could see. If Miss Mills took after her mother in looks, he was sure the daughter would be a real beauty. Mr. Tibbs, father's butler, was the one who let her in the house. Denton couldn't imagine having so much money that he needed a butler just to answer the door. Being a working man all of his life, Denton followed in his own father's footsteps and held jobs. After all, people needed to work for what they wanted. Denton met his friend's stare. Was the butler the only one to see her that you know about? Yes. At least that is what I heard the sheriff say. Then, I'll question the butler next. Denton glanced around the room again, and once more in the hallway. Who found your father this morning? Rebecca, one of the maids. Do you know where I can find her? She might be in the kitchen. I overheard the cook telling her that she needed to get something to eat so that she could handle what has happened. Denton kept himself from chuckling. Nobody else but a cook, or a grandparent, would tell someone that. Thank you. I'll do my best to discover who killed your father. Before Denton could turn to leave, Terrence grasped his arm, stopping him. The man's glare was piercing. Denton, I already told you who did it. If you find Courtney Mills, you'll find the killer. My friend, I promise to check out everyone's alibi. I won't leave any stone unturned. Terrence nodded. I appreciate your help. I'll make sure you're paid well. For the next couple of hours, as Denton asked the butler, Rebecca, and the parents of the bride questions, in the back of his mind, Denton had a feeling there was more to this story. He still couldn't figure out why a woman would kill the old man before the wedding. There was no motive, that Denton knew, which meant he really needed to find Courtney Mills as soon as possible. She'd already gotten a good 4-hour head start on running away. Soon, he mounted his steed and rode away from the house, watching the ground closely. The young woman's parents told him what buggy size she had, which meant the wheels wouldn't be very thick. As he followed a set of tracks away from the estate, he noticed they turned in a different direction, off the main road. Thankfully, it had rained lightly early this morning, and the ground was still muddy in spots. He rode his steed hard, zipping around the trees, trying to imagine how Miss Mills had been able to do this with her buggy and horse. A few times, Denton nearly gave up, doubting that the woman could have maneuvered a vehicle through this part of the woods, but then another wheel track showed up, and so he continued traveling. It was almost dusk when he rode into a small town. His stomach grumbled, reminding him that he should eat to keep up his strength for the journey ahead. A thought nudged him that Miss Mills might have stopped here for food as well, but then he doubted she would stick around for fear of being found. Then again, traveling after dark would be dangerous for a single woman, so he prayed his instincts were correct in that she was still nearby. As his horse trotted through town, he eyed the buildings closely, not only searching for a place that would serve him food, but also for the woman he was hunting. Her parents had given him a miniature of their daughter, and Courtney Mills was a very pretty lady. That would make it easier to spot her. He passed a preacher who was advertising mail-order brides and trying to get women to sign up. Denton rolled his eyes. It surprised him that men were either desperate or didn't enjoy the thrill of courting. Why else would they want to find their future wives quickly? Denton couldn't count how many women he had considered proposing to after courting them for a few weeks, but then he finally decided none would want him to continue his career as a bounty hunter since he'd rarely be home. 3 women walked by the preacher, and the man of the cloth hurried toward them. When the women noticed him, they quickened their pace to pass the man. Denton was sure the preacher was a nuisance to the town. "Please, let me tell you about this wonderful idea," the preacher called out to the women in a loud voice. "Being a mail-order bride will not only help these men, but it will help you, too. These men will take care of you, and all they ask in return is that you marry them and help them with their homes and children. This is a great opportunity for women to start a new life in a new location." A thought popped into Denton's head, and he yanked on the reins, bringing his horse to a stop. Start a new life? Immediately, he thought of Courtney Mills. If the woman were truly on the run, how desperate would she be to become a mail-order bride? After all, why would she leave one unwanted marriage, only to enter into another? However, his gut feeling told Denton to check it out, just in case. After all, he wasn't going to leave any stones unturned, as he'd promised Terence. Denton moved past the preacher, still looking for a place to eat, but for some reason, his gut wasn't pushing him toward food any longer. Instead, the further away he moved from the preacher, the more interested Denton became. And since he had always followed his gut, he yanked the reins around, guiding the animal toward the man of the cloth. When the tall man holding a Bible noticed Denton, he stepped away from his wagon, narrowing his gaze. "Excuse me, sir," Denton began, stopping his horse. "I hope you'll be able to help me. I'm looking for a woman." The preacher started chuckling. "Am I to assume you want me to find you a mail-order bride, too?" "No, not really. I'm looking for a woman that might have come into town sometime today. If she did, I'm sure you would have seen her." "What is her name?" "Miss Mills. She's a pretty woman with darker blonde hair." The preacher frowned and scratched his chin. "I have seen several lovely women today. She would have been driving a one-horse buggy." The preacher's eyes widened. "I helped a lady sign up to be a mail-order bride, and she was driving a buggy. But her name was Miss Peters, or Parker, or something like that." He motioned to his wagon and the table out front with papers on it. "She did sign her name, though." Denton dismounted and followed the man to the table, pulling his horse's reins so the animal would follow. The middle-aged man bent over the sign-up sheet with several men's names, but only a few women's signatures. "Oh, here it is. Miss Parker." The preacher straightened. "I'm sorry, but there is no Miss Mills on my page." Denton should turn and leave, but how often did a lovely woman with blonde hair drive a buggy by herself and was new in town? Suddenly, he realized he had her picture, so he fished in his coat pocket and pulled it out. "This is the woman I'm looking for." He showed the picture to the preacher. The man's eyes lit up, and he smiled. "Yes, this is the woman I helped. Miss Parker." Excitement filled Denton, but he held it inside. Just because this man talked to her didn't mean she was still in town. At least Denton was heading in the right direction. "What do you mean you helped her?" The preacher pointed to the sign-up page. "She is going to be a mail-order bride." Denton wanted to laugh, but for the moment, shock was the emotion inside him. Why would she do something like that, unless perhaps she was guilty of murdering Albert Greenwood, and she needed to disappear? Could be why she used a different last name. Has she already met with her soon-to-be husband? Doubtful. The preacher held the Bible to his chest. She is supposed to send the man a telegram and wait for his answer to meet with him. Will they meet here in town? Probably. The preacher shrugged. Unless the man pays for her to travel to where he lives. It all depends on what arrangements they make. Denton stuffed Courtney Mills' picture back in his coat pocket. Thank you. I appreciate your help. Who are you, sir, and what business do you have with the young miss? The preacher arched an eyebrow. I'm someone who is determined to help her. As Denton headed toward the telegraph office, ideas spun in his head. If Miss Mills had meant to become a mail-order bride, then she'd stay in town until hearing back from her soon-to-be husband. And if she had money, as Terence suggested, then the woman would have gotten her a room at one of the hotels here in town, especially if she had to wait to hear from the man who she'd marry. As he neared the telegraph office, the man inside was starting to close down for the night. Denton hurried to the window, hoping he wasn't too late. Pardon me, sir. Denton pulled out the miniature picture of Courtney Mills. Have you seen this woman? Has she been here to send a telegram to a man? He quickly remembered the man's name that she'd signed next to. Mr. Timothy Graham? Yes, she has been here. Denton's spirits lifted. Have you already sent it? Of course. I'm very fast. Gritting his teeth, his mind worked through ideas of how to stop her from meeting with Mr. Graham, but nothing clever was popping into his head. Do you know how long it takes before getting an answer? The older gentleman shrugged. It varies, but the man she sent a message to lives in Texas. I told Miss Parker to come back tomorrow, but I doubt she will hear that soon. He breathed easier. The woman must have found lodging, which meant she wasn't going to keep running. However, she would be watchful of someone looking for her. Denton reached into his pocket and pulled out a $10 bill and slid it to the clerk. Do me a favor. Don't let her know I was here asking about her. The man grinned, showing him brownish-yellow teeth. I don't know what you're talking about. I've never seen you before in my life. Chuckling, Denton nodded. Thank you. As he walked back toward his horse, his mind was more at ease with the situation. Miss Mills would stay here until she heard from Mr. Graham, and until then, Denton needed to figure what action to take with her. He had no real proof that she killed her fiancé. All she did was run, and that just made her look guilty. Yet, he really doubted that she killed the old man. Then again, he'd have to look into her eyes and read her expression as he questioned her. That would be how he'd know for sure. He mounted his horse and glanced up and down the street. He really needed to find a place to eat and a place to stay the night. Suddenly, he remembered his cousin, Clark Turner, who worked as the foreman on a ranch. Clark always had an open invitation to visit, and since he and his wife, Pearl, didn't live very far from here, Denton decided to visit with his cousin for a bit at the Blue Creek Ranch. After all, Clark was always helpful with ideas on how Denton could catch his runaways. He grinned. He was sure Clark would have a humdinger of an idea. 3. Courtney Mills stepped out of the hotel, wearing a dark gray gown, hoping to give the appearance of a widow. Her bonnet had light black netting that fell over her face, and she had pulled her hair back into a chignon. Since she had to wait around town for a few hours, hopefully, not longer than 24, she must appear that she was in mourning. That was the only way to keep busybody women of the town from trying to talk to her. Smaller towns seemed to be friendly, and although this wasn't the smallest town she'd been in, either was it the largest. The sun shone brightly this lovely morning, giving her a ray of hope that things would go as planned. Last night, after shedding tears of relief for being able to get away from an unwanted marriage, and away from people who would probably blame her for their father's death, Courtney realized that her new life had just been shown to her. The preacher advertising for mail-order brides must have been a sign from God. If that were the case, then she must believe that everything would work out for her. The first thing she did was stroll down the boardwalk, looking at everything the town had to offer. It was relaxing just to enjoy herself, especially since her time would be limited for these pleasures since marriage would put a stop to them. From what she could see, there were 2 barbers, 3 saloons, and 1 very large livery, along with the normal shops that she was used to seeing. Her favorite places had been the mercantile and millinery, but she enjoyed a spending spree at the jewelers on occasion. Many people moseyed along the boardwalks, and as time passed, the streets became busier. Courtney tried not to make eye contact with anyone, but occasionally, her attention met with someone she passed. The men usually tipped their hat and smiled. Most women gave her a nod, but they didn't smile very much. They seemed too busy to get from one store to the next. Courtney's life had been easy. Her parents always had servants to do the cooking, washing, and cleaning. Courtney even had a maid to help her dress and fix her hair. Not that she needed one, but Courtney at least had a friend. Her parents wouldn't allow her to associate with anyone else but people of her class, which was why she had been sent to one of the best boarding schools for girls in California, but once she returned to live at home, she had no other friends other than the servants. She wandered into a clothing store and moved to the rack of the lovely blouses. She didn't need any more clothes, but she must keep her mind busy before she went mad from waiting to hear from Mr. Graham. The telegraph clerk told her to check back later today, even though the man acted as though she probably wouldn't hear from Mr. Graham until tomorrow. A sky blue blouse caught her interest, and she lifted it off the rack. Since blue was her favorite color, it was difficult to pass by anything lovely that held this color without admiring it. As she studied the silk blouse, she imagined what skirt would complement this garment the most. "Are you about ready to come out of mourning?" The woman's voice startled Courtney, and she jumped and quickly spun around. A woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s gave Courtney a polite smile. She tried to ease the fast beating of her heart by breathing slower. Yes. I am." The woman with wild red hair nodded. "I was in mourning once, and I recall counting down the days." Honestly, she folded her arms and stepped closer. "I don't know why they make us wait so long." Courtney sighed. "That's exactly what I've been wondering, too." The woman gingerly touched Courtney's arm. "Was it your husband?" Trying to keep her best melancholy expression, she nodded and took a shaky breath. "It's been very difficult to bear." "Indeed, it is." She motioned toward the rack of clothes. "And you've picked the best way to deal with it." "Thank you." Courtney turned back toward the clothes, hoping the woman would see that she didn't want to talk about it. But as she turned, she bumped into another person. The sudden contact made her drop the blouse. "Pardon me, ma'am." The man bent and lifted the garment off the ground. As he straightened and she looked into his face, she nearly lost her breath. Heavens, he was sinfully handsome with those incredible green eyes. And when he smiled, a dimple flashed in his cheek. Indeed, he would be a hard man to resist. Thankfully, she wouldn't see him after today. He brushed his hand across the garment as if making sure it was wiped clean from the fall, and then he handed it to her. "Forgive me for knocking this out of your hands." "No, it was my fault entirely." She tried not to stare into his eyes for very long for fear of becoming entrapped in their depths. He gave her a full smile before tipping his hat and stepped past her. Courtney breathed a sigh of relief that he wasn't like the other woman who wanted to chat. Men usually weren't like that anyway, so she had nothing to worry about. As she mulled around the shop a while longer, she kept from making eye contact. Already, she talked to too many people in this town. She still feared that Albert Greenwood's children might send the law after her, thinking she'd killed their father. They all hated her, and she would never make them see that she was just a victim, too. Her mind argued with itself, telling her that the sheriff would come looking for her soon. Yet, she thought she'd covered her tracks so that they wouldn't be able to follow her. Hopefully, by the time the sheriff was led to this town, she'd be long gone and married to Mr. Graham. And she hoped the preacher would be gone, too. Noon came, and Courtney returned to the hotel and went into their large dining room for lunch. She quickly found a table and sat. Although the place looked busy, a server came to her table within 5 minutes. Courtney ordered the soup of the day and a slice of homemade bread with jam. She also ordered some tea. After the server left, Courtney cautiously glanced around at the other patrons. It was difficult to keep her eyes downcast, only because she was bored of doing that. Besides, studying people would help keep her mind busy while waiting for her food to arrive. The day wasn't passing nearly fast enough, and she was running out of things to do. Suddenly, her gaze connected with a man sitting by himself at a corner table. When recognition struck, she wanted to look away, but his charming smile and green eyes captivated her from across the room. She quickly gave him a polite nod before quickly resting her gaze back on her table, which was where it should have been this whole time. Her heartbeat quickened, and she hoped she hadn't given him the wrong impression. This was not the time to become friendly with a man, or anyone, for that matter. Time seemed to tick by slowly as she waited for her food. Her nerves were on edge, and she tapped her foot against the table leg. It was difficult to relax now, and her mind spun with things she'd say if he came over. It was too late to tell him she didn't speak English, especially since they talked inside the store. And he probably heard she was a widow, especially since the woman who'd been talking to her had a loud voice. Finally, her food arrived, and she breathed a sigh of relief that the man hadn't come over to talk. She hadn't looked his way and didn't plan to, but she hoped he had already left by now. She found herself rushing through her meal, even if she didn't want to. All she could think about was hurrying up to her room and locking herself inside until it was time to check the telegraph office. Even at that time, she considered dressing as a boy so as not to be noticed. Once she was finished with her meal, she left money on the table and quickly stood. Keeping her gaze to the floor, she hurried out of the dining area and toward the stairs. As she passed through the lobby, she heard one of the hotel clerks calling a familiar name. She stopped and froze. She held her breath as she listened for the name again, not sure if she had heard correctly. "Mr. Graham." She gasped and placed her hand to her mouth. What were the odds that the boy was calling her soon-to-be husband? No, that couldn't be correct. There must be more than one person with that surname. Cautiously, she glanced around the room until she saw the adolescent boy holding up a chalkboard with Mr. Graham's name written across. The boy called out again, and immediately, that man walked out of the dining area and stopped the boy. Oh, heavens! It was the green-eyed man with the charming dimple. She couldn't catch her breath, but she watched closely and listened to him talk to the boy. "I'm Mr. Graham," the man said, pointing to the chalkboard sign. "Oh, you have a telegram." The man gave the boy a coin before he took the telegram and opened it. Courtney didn't move as she watched his gaze wander over the page. Finally, he sighed and folded the page. A pleasant smile touched his mouth, and her heart leaped. She needed to find out if that man was indeed Timothy Graham or related somehow. The quicker she could get out of this town, the better. So then why didn't her feet move to take her toward that man? Once again, her nerves began to quake and her stomach churned with indecision. This was it. She needed to decide about her future now. If she didn't make herself known to him and present herself as the mail-order bride, she would be on the run for a long time, always wondering if the sheriff of Helena had somehow found proof that made them think she was Albert's killer. Although she knew there wasn't any proof, since she was innocent, that didn't mean they wouldn't still point fingers at her. Yet, if Courtney walked across the floor and introduced herself, and if he was really Timothy Graham, she would convince him that she would make a wonderful wife and mother to his children. Once she did that, all of her problems would be taken care of. She took a deep breath for courage and walked toward him, keeping her eye on the target now. When he noticed her, his eyes widened, and his bright smile returned. "We meet again," he said, moving toward her. "Yes." They both came to a stop together. "I suppose we are destined to be introduced." He chuckled lightly. "That's exactly what I was thinking." He held out his right hand. "I'm Mr. Graham." "Are you Mr. Timothy Graham?" "Tim?" "Oh, no. That's my older brother. I'm Denton Graham." The man grinned. Disappointment filled her chest that he wasn't Timothy, but at least she knew he was related and would soon be her brother-in-law. Putting on her best smile, she slipped her hand into his. I'm Miss, she quickly stopped herself before saying Mills, Parker. I am the woman who answered your brother's ad for a mail-order bride. He blinked in shock. You are Courtney Parker? Your brother mentioned me? She pulled her hand away, especially when the warmth from his palm had begun to spread up her arm, making her feel extremely uncomfortable. He did. He held up the telegram. In fact, he just sent this to me in hope of me finding you and bringing you back with me when I return to Oregon. She gasped in surprise. I cannot believe my luck. I only sent your brother a telegram last evening. He nodded. As you mentioned before, we were destined to be introduced. It eased her mind that this man was so kind and willing to assist his brother. If Timothy were half as kind and charming, she'd consider herself lucky to be his wife. May I ask what you're doing in town if you live in Oregon? I'm actually in town to meet a man about obtaining more property for my business. In fact, he offered his arm. If you would like to take a stroll with me outside, I'd love to tell you all about it. Her heartbeat flipped crazily, and when she hooked her hand around his elbow, her pulse increased. It appeared their friendship was getting off to a great start. After all, if he approved of her marrying his older brother, then Timothy would have to accept her, too. 4. Denton's plan was working out splendidly. Or, he should say, Clark's plan was working out. During Denton's visit with his cousin last night, Clark had a brilliant idea, for Denton to pretend to be the prospective groom's brother. Clark gave Denton examples of what he could do, which was why he'd paid the hotel boy to call out his name in the lobby at that exact time Courtney Mills would hear it. So far, things were going perfectly. He wasn't surprised to see Courtney Mills presenting herself as a widow. After all, she would have been one if she'd married Albert Greenwood. Yet, what surprised Denton was that she was so lovely. She had the most mesmerizing eyes he'd ever seen, gray with a touch of blue. Her skin looked so smooth, and her heart-shaped lips practically begged to have a man kiss her passionately. From what he'd learned from her parents, Courtney Mills was a pure woman. They had made sure she was untouched before she married. Because she was innocent in that regard, he wouldn't be the man to show her lips what a passionate kiss was all about. Besides, he couldn't allow her beauty to sway him from his goal. He was here to question her about Mr. Greenwood, discreetly, of course, and try to figure out if she really had murdered her fiancé. Eventually, he'd tell her who he really was, but for now, it was best that she thought of him as her soon-to-be brother-in-law. As he walked her outside, he stood a little taller and prouder. Not often did he get to escort such a pretty lady down the street. Tell me about your business, Mr. Graham, she said sweetly. Timothy and I set up livery stables. We travel from town to town, looking for places in desperate need of these stables. Once we find a location, we scout out the nearby horse ranches to purchase the animals who will be housed in the liveries. How very interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of men in your profession. There aren't many, and I hope to keep it that way. After starting my first livery, I had gotten the idea and then traveled to see family in other states, only to realize the need for more businesses like mine. Timothy was happy to help me. Although it was a complete lie, it wasn't far-fetched. This had been Denton's dream since he was a young man. But when working with the law had become his career, he put his dreams aside. He still hoped that one of these days, he could make his dreams a reality. And the man you're meeting is someone who will run the livery for you, she asked. Actually, the man I will meet will sell me some horses. I've already gotten everything else in the works. Her expression showed signs of panic. Her skin even lost a little color. How long do you plan on staying in town, Mr. Graham? Now he knew why she acted this way. She wanted to get out of town as fast as she could. Well, he had other plans, and he hoped she would have the patience to stay with him throughout the process. After all, he needed time to work up to the questions about the murder. He didn't want to scare her away either. Now that he found her, he wasn't going to let her out of his sight. If he could help it, anyway. I have arranged to meet Clark Turner tomorrow afternoon. In fact, if you'd like to join me, I'll be happy to have you. This wasn't a lie. Denton's cousin had already made arrangements with his employer, Dallas Remington, for Denton to come to the ranch as a prospective buyer. Her eyes widened. For your meeting? Yes. I'll be riding out to Blue Creek Ranch. He pointed in the direction. It's not far from here, and it's a pleasant drive. He patted her hand, still resting on his arm. You can visit with Clark Turner's wife, Pearl. Well, I suppose. If you don't mind me coming. Not at all. Having your company will make the journey more pleasurable. Her cheeks grew red, and she smiled shyly. Then, I shall join you, Mr. Graham. Wonderful, but I must insist that you call me by my given name, Denton. Then I will, Denton. And you must call me Courtney. He smiled, relieved she believed his story so far. In his line of work, telling the truth was difficult to do, even though sometimes he wished he didn't have to deceive so many people. What a lovely name for a lovely woman. Her cheeks flamed red again. He thought it looked adorable. Of course, he should really deter his thoughts away from how pretty she was. He couldn't allow that to distract him. He had a role to play, just as she did. With any luck, he'd get answers from her soon. Within the next few days, he'd either catch a murderer or rule her out. Deep down inside, he hoped he would be able to rule her out. He wouldn't mind getting to know the real Courtney Mills a little better. Courtney tried hard not to stare at the incredibly handsome man next to her, but she found it nearly impossible. Denton was so confident, and the way he spoke and carried himself let her know he was a true gentleman. She tried to imagine what his older brother would look like. She wondered if Timothy would have silver streaks in his dark hair by now, but Denton's thick head of hair didn't show any signs of aging. The man's body was robust, and she hoped Timothy was built the same way. She had realized that by getting to know Denton, she could get to know Timothy better. Perhaps meeting the brother first was the perfect way to start this relationship. Denton, tell me about Timothy's children. He turned them down another street, but this one wasn't as busy. He didn't want people to recognize him, not that they would, but he needed to be cautious. He glanced her way. What have you heard? She shrugged. The preacher that had helped me sign up to be a mail-order bride just mentioned that the prospective grooms had children. I suspect Timothy has children, which is why he's looking for a wife. Denton nodded. He has 2 little girls with black curly hair. She smiled, already preparing for her role as their mother. How old are they? 5 and 3, he answered quickly, thinking of his nieces from his only sister. What are their names? Joanna and Emily. I bet they are adorable. His heart swelled with pride as an image of their faces popped into his head. They are. He hoped when he finally settled down to start a family, he would have girls who looked like Joanna and Emily. He wouldn't mind a few boys, too. How long has their mother been dead? Courtney blinked with quizzical eyes. Denton didn't dare tell her anymore, only because the lie was getting deeper and deeper. The more he lied, the more he'd have to remember what he'd told her so that she wouldn't suspect him of leading her astray. Well, it's hard to say, he began, but a split second later, a man ran into Courtney, knocking her to the ground. Denton stumbled himself since she had been holding his arm, but he kept upright. The man held a bulky leather bag against his chest. Covering the lower half of his face was a bandana. Denton glanced toward the building the man was running from, just in time to see another man coming toward them, clutching a leather bag and wearing a matching bandana over the lower half of his face, too. Denton didn't need to ask questions. He'd been catching criminals for too long not to know what was happening. Immediately, he fisted his hand and punched the man in the face who had knocked Courtney to the ground. As the man grabbed his bloody nose, he dropped the leather bag. When it hit the ground, coins spilled out of it. Courtney gasped loudly, but Denton didn't have time to see if she was all right. He quickly pulled out his pistol and pointed it toward the second man, who came to a sudden stop as his face lost color. The man staring at him with angry eyes fumbled with his pistol, but because he was trying not to lose his money bag, the man was clumsy in his efforts. Using the toe of his boot, Denton kicked the gun out of the man's hand. When it fell beside Courtney, she released a little cry. "Pick up the gun," Denton told her, "and point it at the man next to you." She lifted the gun with shaky hands and pointed it toward the first bank robber, still holding his nose as blood gushed over his fingers. Her arms shook, and Denton knew if it came down to her, she wouldn't be able to shoot anyone in that frightened state. Taking great caution, Denton reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Drop the bag," he told the man, and assumed the position. "I'm sure you've been arrested before, so you will know that you can't outrun me." The man's glare darkened, and he hesitated to do as Denton asked. He would have problems with this one, he was sure. "I mean it," he warned. Immediately, the second man threw the money bag at Denton, but he was prepared and didn't try to catch it. Instead, he kept the gun pointing at him. At that moment, the bank robber took his first step away from Denton, but he was prepared again and so jumped on the man, knocking him to the ground. He yanked the robber's hands behind him and slapped the iron cuffs on. As soon as he was satisfied that the robber wasn't going anywhere, he quickly jumped up and moved to the first man, still howling over his broken nose. Denton quickly yanked the bandana off the man's face and used that to tie his wrists together before rolling him next to his friend. By this time, a few people had gathered, especially those who were from the bank. Denton rested his gaze on the middle-aged man with white hair, wearing a crisp, clean suit of someone who works at the bank. "Have someone fetch the sheriff," Denton told the man, who then turned to a younger man and pointed toward the middle of town. Once the younger man took off running, the middle-aged man and two others started collecting the money spilled out of the bags. Finally, knowing that everything was taken care of, he turned to Courtney. Two women had helped her to her feet, but Courtney's white face told of her scare. Her gaze darted around at the people but mostly stayed on Denton. She held her folded arms against her trembling body. Denton knew she'd ask about what had just happened, about what he'd done with the robbers. After all, most men don't carry a pistol around, and they especially didn't carry around handcuffs. Inwardly, he groaned. It appeared that the truth would come out sooner than he'd wanted. 5. As the shock of the upheaval slowly wore off, Courtney's mind began to work properly, taking her thoughts momentarily off her bruised rump. She pieced together everything that had happened, everything that Denton had done, and she still couldn't believe it all. Had she really seen him hit the man in the face and break his nose? And could she have imagined him taking control over the second bank robber? Where had the handcuffs come from, and why was Denton carrying them in the first place? Although she wanted to admire him for being a hero, things were not adding up. If Denton's occupation was to set up livery stables, he might carry around a pistol. However, livery stable owners did not carry handcuffs. Only men who worked for the law carried handcuffs. Which meant. Her heart sank as her chest tightened. Meeting Denton had not been an accident. In fact, she was willing to bet he wasn't even related to Timothy Graham. Was Denton a sheriff or a deputy? Or a bounty hunter? Courtney realized that meeting Denton had been too coincidental. She'd been so gullible to believe him. Yet, she'd been desperate to find her groom and get married quickly just to leave this state. It was her fault for trusting so easily. The pounding of horses' hooves on the road caught her off guard, and she jumped. Riding toward them was a man wearing a silver star on his leather vest. Slowly, Denton moved toward the man on the horse. Her mind screamed that this was her chance to run. Taking cautious steps, she backed away from the crowd. Her heartbeat hammered against her ribs, and her mind told her now was the time to run as fast as she could. She lifted the bottom of her dress and darted toward the busy street up ahead. These ladies' boots wouldn't allow her much speed, which meant she must find some place to hide before Denton discovered her gone. Not looking back, she quickened her pace, even if her heels were killing her. As she turned the corner, her gaze jumped from one building to the next, from one person to the other as she tried not to bump into anyone in her haste. Up ahead was the saloon. Surely, she'd find somewhere in that building to hide, even if it was upstairs where the painted ladies were housed. Decision made, she headed directly for the saloon. The noise from the crowded street made it impossible to hear if Denton was following her, but she couldn't take even a second to look back to see. She must keep moving forward. 3 more steps and she'd be entering the saloon, a place she never thought she'd enter. But desperation was an emotion that didn't have room to judge. Suddenly, someone grasped her hand tightly, stopping her. She glanced over her shoulder and peered into Denton's worried eyes. "Miss Parker? Are you ill?" He didn't know the half of it, and at this moment, it was all she could do not to lose the contents of her stomach right here, right now. "Please, let me go." She tried to free her arm from his strong grip. However, he wouldn't release her, and instead, pulled her away from the saloon and down an alleyway between 2 buildings. Tears of defeat filled her eyes, but she continued to tug her arm free. Finally, he brought them to a halt and faced her, taking both of her shoulders in his grasp as he stared deeply into her eyes. "Courtney, please stop struggling. I'm not going to hurt you." She blinked rapidly, trying to dry her tears. "Tell me who you really are, Denton, because at this moment, I know you're not a livery owner, and I'm starting to think that Timothy Graham isn't your brother at all." Different emotions played across Denton's face, and Courtney wondered for a moment if he was going to deny the accusation and talk his way out of it. But then, he sighed heavily, and an apologetic smile touched his mouth. "It was the handcuffs that gave it away, wasn't it?" He shrugged. "When I saw the bank robbers, I just reacted." She swallowed hard. "So, you do work for the sheriff?" He shook his head. "Yes, and no. I'm actually a bounty hunter." Her gut tightened, and more tears filled her eyes. "And you came looking for me, didn't you?" Denton nodded. "One of my good friends is Terrence Greenwood. He asked me to find the person responsible for killing his father." The pent-up emotions she'd been holding in since seeing Albert's dead body came rushing forth. Sobbing, she fell against him. His arms wrapped around her and kept her from crumbling to the ground. Panic welled inside her, knowing she was innocent but not knowing how to convince the bounty hunter of this fact. "Miss Mills," Denton said as his palms slowly moved over her back, "you need to tell me what happened yesterday morning." "I didn't kill him." She didn't want to move. With her face pressing into his muscular chest, and his comforting arms around her, for a moment, she felt protected. The feeling wouldn't last, she was certain. "But I need to know what really happened. If I'm to find the person who did this, I need to know everything that you saw and did when you arrived at the manor yesterday morning." She nodded, breathing a little easier. Perhaps she would be able to convince him of her innocence, after all. His calming voice gave her hope that he would hear her out, and believe her words. Courtney found it odd that Denton would want to take her to the Blue Creek Ranch. He'd mentioned that was where he'd stayed last night and that Clark Turner was his cousin. Knowing that Denton had lied about everything he'd told her made her not want to trust him. Yet, he was the only one who could help her, if she could convince him of her innocence. Clark and Pearl Turner were nice people, but Courtney could tell that they looked at her with doubt in their eyes. She wanted to scream, cry, or just punch someone really hard to let out her frustrations. But she must be patient. That was the only thing she had going for her right now. During the stressful trip to the ranch, it was hard not to gaze upon God's creating hand with the landscape. Blue Creek Ranch was absolutely breathtaking. And calming. Autumn was changing colors on the leaves, and the coolness in the air was refreshing. Even when they reached the house where Clark and Pearl lived, Courtney found it charming and welcoming. Pearl brought 2 cups and the steaming pot of coffee to the table where Courtney and Denton were sitting. Pearl poured coffee into their cups and then turned and left the room. Denton took a sip of his coffee before pulling out a small pad of paper and a pencil from his coat jacket. Courtney wrapped her cold hands around the hot cup, but she wasn't ready to drink anything yet. However, the heat from the cup wasn't warming her as she'd hoped. Denton exhaled deeply and leaned back in his chair. Their gazes locked, and her heartbeat accelerated. "Tell me everything that happened from the minute you arrived at the manor yesterday morning." Nodding, she tried to regulate her breathing. "I arrived at the manor early in the morning. Mr. Tibbs let me inside." "Inside the manor, or inside Mr. Greenwood's office?" "The manor." She released the coffee cup and entwined her fingers nervously. The butler informed me that Albert was in his study. Is that when you went there? She nodded. I wanted to talk to him before the wedding because her voice choked up, so she cleared it. I was in hopes of convincing Albert that marrying me would not make either one of us happy. Denton arched an eyebrow. Did he know of your reluctance to marry him? Yes. Both he and my parents knew. She released an uneven sigh. Trying to convince my parents that they were making a bad mistake was like talking to a brick wall. Then what happened? I knocked on his closed door, and it opened immediately because it hadn't been closed very well. Anyway, when I walked in, I noticed that his chair was tipped over. As I moved closer, I saw him lying on the floor with a pool of blood around his head. Tears filled her eyes again. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Do you remember what you were thinking at that time? Of course, I remember. Fear was rushing through me so fast I nearly passed out, but I knew that his children were going to blame me. Did you see the object that killed him? She licked her dry lips. It was George Washington's head. Denton nodded. Yes, the marble bust. Courtney wiped away the tears sliding down her cheeks. Denton, I didn't kill him. Although I didn't want to marry him, there's no way I could have killed him. She took in a shaky breath. That bust of George Washington was too heavy for me to lift, anyway. How could I have lifted it high enough to whack Albert on the head if I couldn't even pick it up? Denton stared at her without blinking. Slowly, his expression relaxed, and a hint of a smile touched his lips. Believe it or not, Miss Mills, that's what I had thought, myself. Courtney sighed as a gush of air rushed from her mouth. She reached across the table and clasped his hand. Indeed? You don't think I killed him? His gaze dropped to her hand before returning to meet her eyes. It didn't make sense for you to kill him. If you'd wanted him dead, you would have waited until after the wedding so that you could get his money as his legal wife. Tears of relief flooded her eyes again. Exactly. But if truth be known, I didn't care about his money, anyway. It was my parents who were marrying me for his money. Denton's attention dropped to her hand again, and this time, he moved his thumb across her knuckles in a soft caress. Miss Mills, I know this is difficult, but can you tell me what happened next? She inhaled in a steady breath. Once I realized that Albert's children would blame me, I knew I couldn't stay there. I was so afraid that nobody would believe me, so I ran. I quickly left the house and left in my buggy. Did you see anyone else during this time? A servant, or one of his children, perhaps? Closing her eyes, she tried to remember if she saw or heard anyone. I didn't see anyone, but I heard voices. She looked at him. I was too panicked to recognize anyone's voice. The only thing that was going through my mind was getting out of there. I didn't want to see the accusing glares from Albert's children, and Terence was one of the worst. Denton sighed and nodded. Needless to say, Terence was very upset. And yes, he did blame you, as well as his sister. I promised them I'd find who really killed their father. She swallowed hard. Do you think you can? I hope so. He released her hand, lifted his coffee cup to his mouth, and sipped. So now I want you to tell me what you've observed during the times you visited with Albert. How did the servants act toward him? A small pound began in her forehead, so she rubbed the annoying spot. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Albert was always nice to the people who worked for him. In fact, I believe he treated his servants better than his own children. Denton tilted his head slightly. Are you certain about that? I couldn't be more certain. I witnessed several times when Louise stormed out of Albert's manor in a heated temper. She flung insults at him and yelled at him when he didn't give her what she wanted. Courtney shrugged. Louise was the youngest, and therefore, the most spoiled. Yes, I've witnessed her tirades a few times. Denton shook his head. But did you ever hear her threaten her father? Courtney frowned. Louise told Albert that she wished he was dead so that he wasn't such an embarrassment to the family. But then, the woman said that so often, I knew she didn't mean it. Denton leaned forward on the table, resting his arms on the wood. Why did Louise think her father was an embarrassment? Because he was marrying a woman who was younger than Louise. She shrugged. All of his children felt that way. Even Terrence had a few heated arguments with his father. Yes, Terrence told me of a few. There was silence for a few moments, and Courtney hoped she had given him enough information. Sadly, that still didn't point Denton in the murderer's direction. She sipped her cooling coffee as she stared at Denton's confused expression. "I'm sorry I wasn't much help." "You may have been." He took hold of her hand gently. "Yesterday, after I had talked to everyone at the house, I tried to decipher what could possibly motivate them to kill Mr. Greenwood. I had ruled out his children from being suspects because they were all wealthy in their own rights, and with their father splitting his wealth 4 ways, I'm sure they wouldn't have ended up with an abundance. However, because they were all embarrassed because their father was marrying such a younger woman, that would give them all motivation to end the man's life." He tapped his finger on her knuckles. "Of course, I would hope that they didn't hate him enough to murder him." "Actually," Courtney said hesitantly, "Albert didn't leave his children any money." Denton hitched a breath and snapped upright. His eyes widened. "Not 1 penny? Albert told me that I would inherit his wealth after we were married." As you can surmise, this was a heated topic between Albert and his children, and I begged Albert to reconsider. I knew that was why they all hated me. Denton pushed away from the table and paced the floor, pushing his fingers through his thick black hair. "So, upon your marriage, the will stated that the children would get no money?" "Correct. But, since Mr. Greenwood didn't get married, the children would still be heirs." He stopped and looked at her. "Right?" She nodded. "Of course." "And you saw the will?" "No, but Albert told me what was in it, which is why I tried to convince him to change it. I didn't want his money, and I certainly didn't want his children to hate me any more than they did." Which meant, Greenwood's children knew, as well. The energy shooting from his eyes made her hopeful that he had a plan. She pushed away from the table and moved to him. "Denton, what are you thinking?" "My feeling is that one of his children is responsible. Whether they did the deed themselves or hired someone to do it, they are the only ones with the motivation for killing their father before his wedding." Excitement pulsed through her, and her eyes watered again. "Oh, Denton. Do you really think so?" "I don't dare hope too strongly that the truth will come out." He took hold of her hands as he stepped closer. "Courtney, I'll try my hardest to prove your innocence, but it might take some time." "Thank you," she mouthed since her throat was choked with emotion and no words were forthcoming. She tried to keep her heart from bursting with gratitude, but she couldn't stop her feet from stepping closer to him as she rested her head against his chest. Right away, his arms wrapped around her. She trembled, but for different reasons this time which she couldn't explain. All she knew was that she finally felt at ease for the first time since she saw Albert's dead body. 6. Denton's chest was tight, and yet, his breaths were ragged. Usually, he didn't get involved with women who were connected to his cases, especially if they were a suspect. Yet, his feelings told him that Courtney had nothing to do with Mr. Greenwood's death. And now that he knew about the will, he felt even stronger that the killer was one of Greenwood's children. However, that wasn't what made him struggle with his heartbeat. It was the way she had gazed into his eyes as if he were her rescuer, her hero. Then, as she moved against him and he smelled her intoxicating scent of lavender, all he wanted to do was hold her and caress her silky hair. Her body trembled, which caused him to tighten his hold. A small sound escaped her throat, like a sigh floating on the breeze. He'd never heard anything so incredible in his life, and the flipping of his heartbeat warned him that he would soon be crossing dangerous waters if he didn't pull back. Although his mind sent out the warning, his arms refused to release her. Her palms rested on his chest, just below her forehead. He felt the uneven way she inhaled and exhaled, and the heat from her mouth melded through his shirt, stirring feelings inside him that he hadn't experienced for a few years. His body reminded him exactly how lonely he'd been lately. Denton's mouth turned dry, and he tried to remain calm and in control. But the longer he held her and heard her pleasurable sighs, the more he wanted to hear more of her sighs. He couldn't stop thinking about her heart-shaped mouth, and when he had first met her, he wanted to be the one to bring passion to her irresistible lips. Kissing her right now could not happen. Even Denton's professional thoughts reminded him that these out-of-control feelings would have to wait until after the case was solved, and the real murderer was behind bars. "Courtney," he said with a cracked voice, wondering why he had even spoken when his mind and body were battling right now. She lifted her head and peered into his eyes. Inwardly, he groaned. She had the most wondrous grayish-blue eyes that could bring a man to his knees. He was definitely feeling the hypnotic effects. He swallowed hard, trying to bring moisture to his overly dry throat. "Courtney, perhaps we should," his mind went blank. He had no idea why his thoughts had taken him down that road. Wasn't he trying to break them apart because of his intense reaction to her? Courtney's gaze dropped to his mouth, and her gaze darkened. Oh, dear. He could forget about being in control now. Her expression spoke volumes right now, and her silent plea was for him to kiss her. He was sinking, and fast, but strangely enough, he didn't care. He wanted to feel her mouth beneath his as he kissed her passionately. Curse his lonely hide. Slowly, he lowered his mouth. She lifted as if to meet him halfway. Just as his lips brushed hers, heavy footsteps pounded on the floor, coming from the other room. Immediately, Courtney jumped out of his arms and stepped back to the table, turning away from him. It was then when he realized how difficult it was to breathe. "Denton, you've got to see this." Clark hurried in the kitchen before coming to a quick stop. In his hands was a newspaper. His wide-eyed gaze jumped back and forth between Denton and Courtney. Did I interrupt something?" Denton didn't know if he was upset at his cousin for stopping the kiss, or relieved that his cousin barged in unexpectedly so that Denton could clear his head. "No, you haven't interrupted anything." He motioned to the newspaper. "What do you want me to see?" "Well, I don't think you're gonna like it." Hesitantly, Clark handed the folded newspaper to Denton. As he opened it, his gaze fell on a sketch of Courtney on the front page of the Helena Gazette. The headline above the sketch read "Murderer on the Run." Denton didn't need to read the small article to know what it said. He grumbled a curse under his breath and crumpled up the paper. If Courtney saw this, she'd be devastated. This is ridiculous. Don't people believe in finding proof before hanging a person? Courtney's face paled. "I'm in the paper?" Clark nodded. "I'll have Pearl do some skin around town to see who might have given the newspaper the false information. I'll give you 4 guesses," she said in a tight voice, "and all of them have the last name of Greenwood." Denton had been thinking the exact same thing. Now, more than ever, he needed to prove she was innocent. Either that, or he needed to get her as far away from Montana as he possibly could where nobody would know her face. Even if it meant walking through fire, he'd do all he could to find the person who killed Albert Greenwood. Once dinner was over, Clark and Denton left the house, leaving Courtney alone with Pearl. She had put the children down for the night and then returned to the living room to keep Courtney entertained. Of course, her nerves were all over the place. Denton wouldn't let her see the newspaper, but all she had to do was look at his red face to know that whatever had been printed wasn't good at all. At first, Pearl tried to relax Courtney by telling stories about her children. The older woman's tactic had worked for a little while, but then Courtney became restless again. She wanted to go outside and enjoy the beauty of the mountains. She wanted to walk as she tried to burn off her frustrations. But mainly, she wanted to be with Denton. She knew she shouldn't have trusted him so easily, but once he admitted to believing in her innocence, she couldn't help but forgive him for what he'd put her through since they met. But more than that, she thought about their almost kiss. How things had led up to that point, she didn't know, but now she wanted to bring back that mood and have him look into her eyes and see the desire flaming in his green orbs. Pearl had been trying to teach Courtney how to crochet for the last 20 minutes as they sat next to each other on the sofa, but the older woman wasn't successful in her endeavors. Because this was the first time Courtney had ever crocheted, she found the sport quite confusing. Holding her fingers just right as the yarn weaved around one finger to the next made her hand cramp. As a young girl, Courtney had learned how to pass her time painting. Her parents made certain Courtney had the best art teachers, which soon became her favorite thing to do when her parents weren't having her help them entertain the neighbors or their town. Now, more than anything, she wished she had her canvas, paints, and brushes. Letting her mind create pictures to paint would surely calm her and think of more pleasant things than catching a killer. Pearl had been quiet for a few moments as she whipped her crochet needles so fast that the blanket she was making nearly came to life, right before Courtney's eyes. That was a talent she would never possess. "Miss Mills?" Pearl asked, glancing up for a moment to look at Courtney. "Yes?" She lowered her tangled yarned hands to her lap. "Denton mentioned that you are wealthy." "My parents are, and I will get some of my father's money when I turn 25. "How many more years until that happens?" "I'm 23 already, so I won't have to wait too long." Pearl smiled, still watching her fingers spin the needles as she created the blanket. "I've never known anyone rich." She glanced up at Courtney again. "And then Denton talks about his friend, Terrence Greenwood, and now I know about two people with a lot of money." Courtney sighed and tried to smile. "Money isn't that wonderful. The love you and your husband have is worth more money than any of the Greenwood children have." Pearl stopped her crocheting. "Your parents weren't in love?" Courtney shrugged. "They were, but they loved money more, which is why when their friend, Albert Greenwood, mentioned marrying again, my parents couldn't wait to sell me to the highest bidder." Clenching her jaw, she didn't want to say anymore. She was still upset at her parents for what they tried to do and going against their only daughter's wishes. "Then, can I assume you are relieved that you didn't have a wedding yesterday?" Courtney frowned. "I am relieved, but then if Albert hadn't been killed, I wouldn't be running for my life right now. Denton will find his man, or woman. He's one of the best bounty hunters I know." Seeing Pearl's appreciation shining in her eyes softened Courtney's heart. "Tell me about him." "He doesn't like to talk about himself much." Nodding, Pearl chuckled. "That's for certain." She resumed her crocheting. "He comes from a close-knit family, but he is the only one out of his siblings who isn't married." "Why not?" "I suppose it's because of his career. He never stays in one place for very long since he's busy chasing outlaws. But I know he'd make a good father. He absolutely dotes on his nieces, Joanna and Emily." Hearing those names was a fresh reminder of how Denton had purposely lied to her. Then again, they were his nieces, so that hadn't been a lie, just everything else. However, if roles were reversed and she'd been looking for a murder suspect, she would have lied to get some answers. She must believe that he was telling her the truth now. Men's voices echoed from the other room, and she recognized Denton's deep baritone immediately. Courtney sucked in a quick breath and straightened her shoulders. Mother had always told her that slouching was for ill-mannered girls, and Courtney definitely couldn't be considered in that category. As soon as Denton looked her way, he smiled. Her heart flipped crazily, and she wished it wouldn't. She had enough on her mind with Albert's murder, and she didn't need anything to complicate her emotions. Clark moved to his wife and kissed her cheek. "Have you been gettin' to know Miss Mills better?" Pearl smiled wide. "Indeed, I have." Denton glanced at the tangled yarn in between Courtney's fingers and nodded. "What are you making?" Courtney rolled her eyes. "A mess." She untangled the yarn and set that and the crochet needle aside. "But I've had all the fun I'll be having with this today." She stood. "If you don't mind, I would like to take a walk outside." "I think that's a great idea." He offered his elbow. "Do you mind if I join you?" "I wouldn't have it any other way." Courtney wondered why she would talk this way, especially since flirting was not something she should be doing right now. However, it wouldn't be polite to ignore his arm, now that he had offered it. She hooked her hand around his elbow, and he led her out of the house. The evening was perfect. A small chill breezed around her, but the cooler temperature was refreshing. Pearl's house was almost too warm for Courtney. The sun had made its descent behind the mountains. The sparse clouds appeared lavender with splotches of yellow in the sky. It amazed her that she'd never really taken the time to study Montana's sunsets before. With her uncertain future, she realized she wanted to see more sunsets, and she especially wanted to feel as peaceful as she did at this very moment. Was it the sunset or the man she was with that made her feel such joy? Either way, the two made a great combination. Part of her wanted to keep them both in her life, forever. 7. Although the sunset was breathtaking tonight, Denton couldn't get his eyes off something lovelier. He watched Courtney's eyes light up as she studied the sky, and the awe on her expression was quite noticeable. He had gathered that she had been raised in Montana, and he wondered why she found the scenery so spellbinding. Then again, that's how he thought about her right now, which was why he didn't want to look at anything else. "Did you have a good visit with Pearl?" Courtney swung her gaze to him. "Yes, I suppose it went well." She sighed. "But I can tell she and her husband doubt my innocence." "No, they trust my feelings, and I've told them both how I don't think you did it." She shrugged and dropped her hand from his arm as they strolled side by side in the yard. "I cannot explain it, then, but I see a bit of distrust in the way they look at me." "Then we'll have to change that really soon, won't we?" She nodded. "The sooner, the better. While you were with Pearl, I went riding with Clark and had a lot of time to think. I'm starting to believe I don't know Terrence's siblings very well, and so I need to rely on you to help me." She stopped suddenly, and her gaze jumped up and met his eyes. "Me? Why would I know about Albert's children? None of them liked me, and so we didn't converse much." "True. However, I think Albert would have talked about his children. Or, you might have heard one of his servants gossiping. One way or another, I think you have heard something that might be helpful in this case." She frowned and twisted her hands against her middle. "Oh, Denton. I want to help you, truly I do, but the 5 times I had visited with Albert alone, I don't think he talked much about his children." He needed to calm her down, reassure her that she could do this. "Courtney," he said, gently cupping the side of her face, "take a deep breath and relax." He waited for her to follow his instructions, and when her chest slowly rose and fell, her shoulders relaxed. "Close your eyes now, and I want you to think back to the first time you'd met Albert, the first time you really had a good conversation with him." Courtney's eyes closed, and her breathing evened out. He moved closer and caressed both her shoulders, trying to help her keep calm. "Tell me about the meeting." "My parents took me to his estate. I was devastated by their decision to sell me to a man so much older. I was angry at them, and my attitude wasn't very pleasant." She kept her eyes closed. "Albert was understanding, and while we all sat in his parlor, he and my parents discussed the wedding arrangements and the money situation." She went quiet for a few moments and then cleared her throat. "I was bored to tears, and at one point during that afternoon, I excused myself to stretch my legs. I was actually surprised they allowed me to walk out on the wraparound porch." She gave a lengthy pause, and then she gasped, and her eyes flew open. Her gaze locked with his. "Denton, I did overhear 2 of Albert's servants. I think they worked in the stables." Excitement rushed through Denton, and he moved his hands down to hers, clasping them lightly. "Tell me what you heard." "The stable boys were discussing Clive Greenwood's financial status. At the time, I thought it was ridiculous for the servants to gossip about a man who didn't live there, but the servants were saying that Clive was a gambler and that Albert had threatened to cut him off." Relief swept through Denton, and he squeezed her hands, reassuringly. "This is wonderful, Courtney. Is that all you heard?" "After I heard them talking, I walked further toward the edge of the porch to see who was gossiping, and they saw me and quickly left." "You're doing great." He winked. "Now, think back to the other conversations you had with Albert. Did he say anything about his children?" She licked her lips. "The day I met them all, I learned that Wallace owned stocks in several hotels, and he was very successful. Patricia, Albert's oldest daughter, had married a wealthy man, so she was taken care of. Clive didn't talk about what he did for a living, though." She frowned during her pause. "But Terrence has a share in the railroad, and Louise," she paused again, and her forehead crinkled. "I don't recall what she does." "She stays at Albert's estate quite a bit, but she also lives in a townhouse." Denton nodded. "If I recall, Terrence mentioned how spoiled his sister was, and how he wished that she would find a husband. I'm assuming she lives off her father's money. Courtney arched an eyebrow. That's motive for wanting to kill Albert, right? Yes, and no. I'd think Louise would want her father alive in order to keep giving her money. If she were upset about her father wanting to give all of his money to his soon-to-be wife, I'd think that Louise would want you dead, instead. Courtney's face paled slightly. Then, I can be thankful that Louise didn't think of doing that. Denton rubbed the pads of his thumbs across her knuckles in a soft caress. I'm relieved, as well. However, I'm not going to cross her off my suspects list. She still has motivation, although it's not as strong as Clive's. He shifted from one foot to the other. But that just means I need to head back to Helena and do some digging. Disappointment registered on her expression, and his heart melted. She did care about him. The quick beat of his heart reminded him, again, that he should not be having these feelings for her. Do you want me to come with you? He gave her a tender smile and reached up and cupped the side of her face again. I'd love to bring you with me, but with the sheriff looking for you in Helena, I don't know where to keep you that would be safe. Her frown deepened. I can't go anywhere now. Her voice choked. Since the newspaper decided to show a sketch of my face, people will recognize me. Denton's mind clouded with thoughts. He really didn't want to leave her with Clark and Pearl. Yet, taking her to Helena was out of the question. Unless... He cocked his head and narrowed his gaze on her. I wonder what you would look like as a brunette. Her eyes widened, and a smile touched her tempting lips. Yes. I could disguise myself. Her skin was so soft, and he wanted to continue caressing her face, but the feelings it invoked inside his chest made him pull back. I'll have to get us rooms at the hotel, but as long as you stay there while I'm doing some research, I think you'll be fine. She nodded. Yes. I'm sure I'll be able to help you with the case in some way, too. That's my plan. The enthusiasm inside him was bursting with anticipation. Oh, Denton. Sighing, she closed the space between them and pressed her cheek against his chest. You'll never know how grateful I am that you are on my side. Struggling for some composure over the intimate moment, he breathed slowly and deeply. Although he didn't want to, his arms wrapped around her loosely as if they had a mind of their own. He closed his eyes and breathed in her flowery scent. Courtney, he said in a voice that was too deep. I think we need to keep our relationship more casual. She tilted back her head and looked up at him. Sad eyes met his gaze, and his heart wrenched. I thought, she licked her lips. I mean when you almost kissed me earlier. Yes, I know, he quickly explained. I had let my guard down, and I shouldn't have. He shrugged. I had become lost in your mesmerizing eyes, and well, the temptation was great. Her expression relaxed, and her eyes darkened. Either that, or it was the sun dipping further behind the mountain. Yet, once again, the mood was set. Curse those moods. He was a weak and very lonely man. Forgive me, she whispered. I don't mean to be a temptation. Just talking about enticement made it worse. He was sinking, and he couldn't swim, or maybe, he just didn't want to swim. The fast rhythm of his heartbeat was taking control over his mind, and all he wanted to do was kiss her passionately. You just cannot help it, he told her. And neither can I. He couldn't fight it anymore, and as he brushed his lips over hers, she melted against him, confirming that she'd been anticipating this almost as much as he had. He tightened his arms around her, proceeding with the kiss. Her hands wandered up to his chest, and she hooked her arms around his neck, which fit her body even closer against his. He kept the kiss gentle and unrushed. He figured she wasn't used to kissing a man, especially since Albert Greenwood had disgusted her. But she seemed to participate without hesitation. Denton tilted his head and deepened the kiss. A throaty sigh escaped her, the most wonderful sound he'd ever heard. And heaven help him, it nearly drove him over the brink of madness. His heart soared higher than it had ever done before, and he thanked God that his chest kept it from flying out of his body. It felt wonderful to kiss a woman passionately, but his mind tried to argue that kissing this particular woman might cause heartache in time. If his heart got involved, he'd be in big trouble. Yet, he still wanted to take her to Helena with him so that he could make sure nobody caught her and took her to the sheriff. The newspaper article about her had mentioned a reward. Apparently, Albert's children were going to pin this on Courtney, no matter if she was innocent or not. He couldn't allow that to happen. Arresting the wrong person for Albert Greenwood's murder was not justice. Denton broke the kiss and leaned his forehead against hers. Nothing was said as they held each other, and their deep breaths were in sync. "Maybe," he said finally, "we shouldn't have done that." She grinned and straightened. Or perhaps it was meant to be? He didn't want to think of that. For now, he was going to take one day at a time and see what happened. "I'll talk to Clark and see if he can put us up for the night. First thing in the morning, we'll head to Helena. I'll need a wig." "True. Maybe I'll make a quick stop into town and find you one before we leave tomorrow." She exhaled a deep breath. "I truly cannot wait until this is over and the murderer is found and locked away." "I agree. But you must keep in mind that people will still look at you as if you have committed a crime. They don't forget so easily, especially when an important figure in the community has been killed." A frown claimed her face. "What will I do, then?" He caressed her cheek. "We'll deal with that matter when it happens. So, until then, let's find us a killer." 8. Courtney scratched underneath her dark brunette wig. Again. She'd lost count on their journey to Helena how many times the blasted wig had made her head itch. She couldn't wait to lock herself inside a hotel room and take off her disguise. Not only was she wearing a dark wig, but she had stuffed a pillow in her blouse and skirt to look pregnant. That wasn't easy since most of her clothes fit her snugly around the middle. They'd taken her buggy with Denton's horse tied to the back, and as they rode through the main street in Helena, Courtney pulled back in the seat and stopped fidgeting. She didn't want to draw attention to herself. Denton had also worn a disguise. He'd told her that several people in Helena recognized him, and they would definitely notice when he suddenly had a woman on his arm. He wore a top hat like an upper-class gentleman and even found a fake mustache and spectacles. Out of the two, he was the one who looked like someone entirely different. She still felt that her face and eyes would give her identity away. They stopped at the hotel, and Denton climbed down, using his walking stick for show only, and helped her out of the vehicle. She kept her gaze down to the ground as she hooked her arm around his and moved with him inside the building. As Denton stood by the counter to check them in, she pressed herself to his side and kept from looking around the lobby. He checked them in as Mr. and Mrs. Dwayne Parker. She wasn't sure if her fluttering heart was due to her nerves, or because she looked forward to pretending to be his wife. The kiss they had shared last night had stayed on her mind, keeping her from getting much sleep, and definitely keeping her daydreaming during their journey. Denton was a very passionate man, and being married to him would be an everyday thrill for her. Denton tipped a lad who worked for the hotel into bringing up their trunks. Of course, she knew it was only her clothes in the trunks, but nobody else had to know that. Denton played the part of the aristocrat gentleman perfectly. It eased her worries slightly that perhaps nobody would notice they were in disguise. It was a good thing he was with her. She would have botched this up by now on her own. They didn't say anything as they climbed the stairs to their room, and once they were inside and the trunks were hauled up, Denton closed the door and locked it. She sighed heavily and yanked off her wig, tossing it on the bed. She scrubbed her fingers through her hair, pulling it out of the tight coil it had once been, but she didn't care. Her poor scalp had been punished enough. Denton chuckled and took off his mustache and spectacles. "I take it that the wig didn't suit you, Mrs. Parker?" She rolled her eyes. "All it did was make my head itch." "Then, I'm relieved you won't be going out with me this evening when I visit Albert's estate. I will stay inside and read a book." She nodded decisively. "And, you mustn't answer the door, not for anyone. I'll have a key, so you don't need to worry about me." He moved to the bed and took off his top hat and his long coat. He dug through his carpet bag and pulled out his regular coat and hat. Courtney had to admit she thought he was much better looking this way. Do you think Albert's children are still at his estate? Denton shrugged. I don't know, but I would think they are. They need to get their father ready for burial, and then they'll have to figure out what to do about his estate. Courtney moved to the wall and leaned her back against it as she watched Denton prepare himself to leave as the bounty hunter. What they were pretending was very improper, but what other choice did they have? Although this was wrong, being away from her heartless parents and on her own gave her a sense of freedom she'd never had before. She liked feeling as if she was in control of her own life, even though at the moment, she still felt helpless. That would change. She was confident Denton would discover something. I'm sure Louise will claim the estate, especially when everyone else has their own place to live, she said, returning to the conversation. He glanced at her and winked. I was thinking that very thing. Then, am I to assume she will be the first one you start questioning? You assume correctly, Mrs. Parker. She smiled, loving how he kept calling her that name as if he enjoyed their role play. Of course, she knew it would come to an end. The only thing she wouldn't miss would be the wig. He stuffed his pistol inside his coat and turned to her, smiling. I have a good feeling about this. God willing, I'll catch the killer today. And I will pray that you do. He stood staring at her for several undisturbed seconds, and her heartbeat quickened. Would he kiss her before he left? She wouldn't mind it at all. He took another pistol out of his carpet bag and placed it on the bed. I'm leaving this here for you, just in case you need it. She stared at the weapon and gulped. I'm not sure I can use one. You saw what happened the last time I held a gun. I have faith in you. He winked. Besides, that last time you held a gun, the bank robbers had pointed the gun at us, so it was a natural reaction to have. All right. I just hope I don't have to use it. Me, too. He headed toward the door, and her hopes sank. It looked as if she wasn't going to get a kiss. Goodbye, after all. Remember, he said as he rested his hand on the doorknob, don't open the door for anyone, and stay away from the window. I'll do nothing but read and sleep while you're gone. She gave him a reassuring smile. He left the room, and she heard him lock the door on the other side. Sighing, she frowned. Already, she missed him. The rest of the day was going to be very boring. Denton was determined, and he wouldn't let anything get in the way. He'd convinced himself that he needed that minor distraction when he kissed Courtney last night, but now he would do what he was being paid for and find Albert's killer. He wouldn't allow himself to think of the beautiful woman who sighed like an angel and kissed so passionately. And he definitely wouldn't daydream about his future and how he'd love to settle down with the perfect woman and have children. And thinking about living in a small town with his family and changing professions would have to come later, too. It hadn't taken him long to reach the Greenwood estate. The butler, Mr. Tibbs, let him in. Good afternoon, Tibbs, Denton greeted nicely. Good afternoon, Mr. Reed. The older man arched a bushy white eyebrow. If you have come to speak with Master Terence, he is not here. Denton's enthusiasm waned slightly. When will he return? Not for a few days. He is traveling to Stumptown. Stumptown? Did he say why? He just said he was looking into purchasing a fishing boat. Denton wanted to roll his eyes, and at the same time, he squashed the jealous feelings of not knowing what it was like to have that much money. Then, I'll have to speak to him when he returns. He glanced around the spacious hallway. Is any of Albert's children at the estate today? Master Clive and Miss Louise are here. Splendid. Denton's hopes lifted again. Can you tell them I'm here? I'd like to speak with them in the parlor. He nodded toward the nearest room. Yes, Mr. Reed. I'll fetch them now. As Denton moved into the room, his gaze partook of all the marbled statues and busts used as decorations. Mr. Greenwood must have had an obsession with these. Denton was willing to bet he'd find them in every room on the estate's main floor. He walked to one that looked to be the size of the bust that smashed Albert's head. As he picked it up, he weighed the object in his hands. In his mind, He pictured a petite woman like Courtney trying to lift it high before quickly bringing it down and whacking someone over the head with it. Denton shook his head. There was no way Courtney could do this, which meant. He frowned. Perhaps he should take Louise off his suspects list since she was petite like Courtney. That left Clive. The man had a gambling problem, and if he knew that his father had changed the will, Clive might want to lash out at his parent. I hope you are here to bring us some good news, Mr. Reed. Denton jerked out of his thoughts and turned toward Miss Greenwood. She wore a black morning dress, and her dark red hair was pulled back in a tight coil at the back of her head. Her face was pale, and the color of her hair only made it worse. He'd never seen her look so drab. Black was definitely not her color. Good afternoon, Miss Greenwood. I actually don't have any good news to give you, not yet. She scowled. You didn't find Miss Mills? She huffed. Then what have you been doing these past few days? Denton didn't like it when people assumed he wasn't doing his job, but he held his tongue under the circumstances. I did find Miss Mills. He nodded. I questioned her, and I don't think she killed your father. Louise gasped loudly. You've got to be joking. Of course, she killed father. She was about to marry a man twice her age, and she wanted out. Miss Greenwood, Denton said, trying to stay calm, I've been a bounty hunter for a few years. By now, I think I know what makes a person guilty and what makes them innocent. He stepped closer to her. Please, let me do my job. I assure you, I know how to find a killer. She shook her head. You may be Terrence's friend, but you're not mine, and I don't have any faith in you at all. You probably took one look at Miss Mills and decided that someone that lovely couldn't possibly be a murderer. She folded her arms across her chest. Miss Mills probably batted her long eyelashes at you, and you fell head over heels. Denton received the impression that Louise was jealous of Courtney. Then again, Louise really wasn't considered that pretty. He was sure that when men looked at her, they only saw dollar signs. Her rotten temperament was something most genteel women didn't possess either. Miss Greenwood? Did you actually see Miss Mills kill your father? Of course not. Where were you that morning? Maybe you saw something that might lead me to the killer. I was in my room, asleep. You can ask the servants if you don't believe me. I usually sleep until mid-morning. Denton didn't believe her. She'd used the word usually, which led him to believe that she just might have been awake that morning. Yet, even if she was awake, would she have the strength to lift the bust of George Washington? He might have to test her. Did you not plan on attending your father's wedding ceremony? She rolled her eyes. Why would I? Father knew I didn't approve of his fiancé, none of his children approved of her. So, none of you were going to attend the ceremony? Not one of us. She shrugged. And father knew that. Denton slowly walked toward her and pointed to the bust of Marie Antoinette on a pedestal. I've always wondered about these in your father's home. Why does he have so many? That was my mother's pride and joy while she was alive. She made them. Her signature is on all of them. He arched an eyebrow in surprise. Really? How amazing. Where is her signature? She lifted the bust of Marie Antoinette and showed him the bottom. Although he pretended to look for the dead woman's signature, he mainly studied how Louise held the bust. She didn't seem to struggle with it, yet he could see it was heavy by the way she cradled it in her arms. Disappointment crept over him. He really wanted Louise to be guilty so that he could arrest her right now. I must admit, he said, straightening, that I've never seen anything like it. Your mother had a great talent. Yes, she did. Louise placed the bust back, turned toward Denton, and took a deep breath. I wish my mother were still alive. Then none of this would have happened. Indeed. He blew out a heavy breath. Have you seen Clive? Tibbs was supposed to have found him for me. She shrugged. I'm not my brother's keeper, which is a good thing, or I'd be at the saloons and gaming tables most of the time, and if you must know, I have better things to do with my days. I'm right here, Clive snapped as he swaggered into the room. The man's eyes were bloodshot, and Denton could smell the stench of alcohol and a painted lady's cheap perfume from across the room. Hopefully, the man was in his right mind to answer some of Denton's questions. Oh, heavens to Betsy, Clive. Louise fanned her hand in front of her face. I'm guessing you were locked away in a bottle of whiskey all night and morning? Clive threw his sister a scowl. Leave me alone. We each grieve in different ways. Louise huffed and turned to Denton. Are you done asking me questions? Yes. You may leave. Finally. Now, I suggest you go do the job Terrence hired you to do, or I'll tell him to find someone else. She spun around and hurried out of the door. Her booted heels clicked on the wooden floor in the hallway. Denton counted to 10 under his breath. He wanted to put the woman in her place, but perhaps he'd do it at a later date. He turned his focus on Terrence's brother and motioned to the nearest sofa. Do you need to sit, Clive? You don't look too steady. Clive brushed his hand in the air as he made his way to the piece of furniture and plopped down. Denton was surprised that the man landed on the seat cushions. Would he get the answers he sought? It was harder to read a man suffering from a hangover, but he hoped this would be the time Denton would know if the man was guilty or not. 9. What was my sister squawking about? Clive mumbled. It's nothing. Denton stepped to the door and closed it. Louise just doesn't know everything a bounty hunter has to do to find a criminal. So, Tibbs tells me you have to talk to me. Denton nodded. I do. He moved to a chair across from the sofa and sat. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. I have heard from Louise and Terrence, but I haven't heard how you felt about your father marrying Miss Mills. Clive shrugged. At first, I didn't care. It was my father's life. What made you start to care? Clive stared at the floor for a few silent moments, and his expression darkened. Did you know, he said slowly, that my father was cutting us all out of his will? Denton was relieved that Clive knew, only because he wasn't sure how to touch on that awkward subject. I learned that yesterday. Do you know how it feels? Clive lifted his bloodshot gaze to Denton, when your father tells you that he's not giving you an inheritance? Denton shook his head. My father wasn't wealthy, so no, I don't know how that feels. You feel cheated. Clive's voice lifted in anger. And when I found out that the old man was going to give everything to his new wife. That was like a kick in the gut. I can't imagine. Denton frowned. Did you ask your father why he did that? Yes. Clive pushed his fingers through his hair. It's because he was tired of seeing his children spend their money on useless things. His expression hardened. My father thought I wasn't worth it. Clive, Denton said, hoping to ask the important question with the right tone of voice as not to upset him. Did you try to stop your father? Many times. He snorted a cynical laugh. But the man was bull-headed. How about the morning of his wedding? Did you try to talk some sense into him then? Clive shook his head. I had been drinking quite a bit after I stormed out of the house the night before. I had fallen asleep in the stable. He shrugged. At least that is where I woke up after Terrence found me to tell me father had been murdered. Inwardly, Denton seethed. Just as he'd thought, the man had been too drunk to remember. Either that, or he was lying. Didn't Clive realize that Denton could ask the servants who worked in the stable to see if Clive was telling the truth? Of course, Denton would do that very thing once he was finished with Clive. In fact, Denton would also find those servants who had been with Albert Greenwood the longest. They would be the dependable ones, and hopefully, the ones that would tell Denton what he wanted to know. Someone had to have seen something. Courtney tossed her book on the sofa and growled in frustration. Denton had been gone for several hours, and she was anxious to hear what he'd found out. She'd promised him to stay inside the hotel, but the walls were closing in on her, and she wanted to scream. She left the couch and moved to the window. Keeping the curtain drawn, she peeked through the slit and looked at the busy street below. From the color of the sky, Courtney could see that the sun was making its descent on the horizon. Many people still littered the streets, and even some children were seen playing on the boardwalks while their mothers visited with other women. Carefully, Courtney lifted the window to let in some cooler air. So far, nobody, that she could see, had looked her way on the second floor of the hotel. She was grateful for that. Out of the corner of her eye, a woman with burnt red hair, wearing a black gown with the same colored shawl, stopped near the corner of the building just across the alleyway from the hotel. Courtney only knew one woman with that wild color of hair. Louise. Sucking in a panicked breath, Courtney pulled away from the window, yet continued to peek out to see what Louise was doing by the saloon. The woman anxiously glanced up and down the street as she twisted her hands against her middle. Courtney wondered why someone in mourning would be out in public and near the saloon, for heaven's sake. Her stomach churned with suspicion. Although she'd promised Denton not to leave the room, she must get closer to Louise to see what the woman was doing. Quickly, before she could change her mind, she wound her hair in a coil again and placed the itchy wig on her head. She stuffed the pillow up her skirt and then grabbed a cloak. Noticing the gun Denton had left on the bed, she snatched it and slipped it into the waist of her skirt, covering it with the cloak before hurrying out of the room and down the stairs. When she walked outside, she kept her gaze to the ground and slowly moved in the direction where Louise was still waiting against the brick wall. When she reached the end of the hotel, a man had stopped beside Louise. The woman pulled on the sleeve of his coat as they ducked in the alleyway. Courtney stayed against the corner of the hotel, placing her hands on the pillow under her skirt, hoping to give the appearance that she had stopped because of her unborn child. Keeping her back toward Louise and the man, Courtney prayed that they wouldn't see her as she listened intently to their conversation. "Another issue has arose, and this time, I trust you'll not mess things up." Louise's voice was agitated. Courtney slowly peeked in their direction. Louise scowled at the man as she shoved a money bag against his chest. "I swear on my mother's grave," Louise bit out, "that if you don't do what you're paid to do, I'll be the one to kill you." "Yes, Miss Louise." The man's scarred face scrunched in an unpleasant expression. "But it wasn't my fault. Your brother came. Don't worry about Terrence. I'll take care of him. But I want you to get rid of Denton Reed. He is at the estate right now. He is asking too many questions, and he'll soon discover the truth, which won't be good for either of us." Courtney caught her breath before she gasped out loud. What was going on? Yet, deep in her heart, she knew what she'd just overheard. Louise was paying the man to kill Denton. So, did that mean Louise had killed her own father? Panic grew inside Courtney, and she knew she must stop Louise, and especially the man. Because Denton hadn't returned from the estate, he would be in grave danger. He wouldn't know of Louise's plan. Courtney just couldn't sit by and hope that Denton could protect himself, especially since he didn't know about the impending danger. She was tired of being idle, and she wanted to help find the real killer. She pulled away from the wall and hurried toward the stable not far from the hotel where her horse and buggy had been housed. She couldn't see anyone in the stable to help her, so she quickly unhooked her horse from the buggy and mounted. The pillow stuffed up her skirt became uncomfortable, but she didn't have time to remove it. She must find Louise, or the man, and follow them. As she guided the horse toward the street, she noticed Louise briskly walking toward the family coach. Courtney's heart dropped. Where was the man? Could she remember him if she saw him again? Taking deep breaths, she closed her eyes and tried to remember what the man looked like. His face was cut up, but the deepest scars were on his cheek and chin. His hair was dirty blonde, and his coat was ragged around the edges. He was taller than Louise by a good 5 inches. She sighed with relief and opened her eyes. Denton had her do that when he was trying to get her to remember. She was glad it still worked, even if he wasn't here to help her calm down. The one thing Courtney knew was that this man would be heading toward Albert's estate, so that was where she needed to go. Her chest tightened. Silently, she prayed that she wouldn't get noticed. If any of Albert's children or servants saw her, they'd capture her and give her to the sheriff. That could not happen. As she rode toward his estate, she scanned the streets, looking for the unkempt, scar-faced man. Would he be on horseback, too? Yet, if he were being tasked with killing Denton, the man would be stupid not to have a quick getaway. Panic grew inside her, and she urged the horse faster. Reaching Denton first was her goal, and she didn't want to think about what would happen if the scar-faced man fulfilled his agreement with Louise. Courtney's stomach churned again. It had only been a few days, but she'd grown close to Denton, and she didn't know what she'd do if he weren't helping her. But it was more than that. She'd found herself attracted to the handsome and kind-hearted man. Her parents hadn't allowed her to meet other young men or even have feelings for them. They wanted her to enter the marriage to Albert without knowing what love was all about. Sadly, all she'd known was despair. Then she met Denton. She should have hated him for lying to her there at the beginning, but once she got to know him better, it was hard not to let him melt her heart. She didn't want any other man but him, and she prayed she wouldn't have to look any further. After about 10 minutes, she slowed the horse as she came closer to the estate. Her stomach lurched. The last time she made this journey was on her wedding day. That had been the worst day of her life. She noticed Louise had made it back home safely since she had just left the coach and entered the manor's front door. Courtney maneuvered the horse to the thicket of trees, hoping to keep hidden for a little while longer. Once she found a good spot, she dismounted and tied her horse to a tree. Courtney noticed the pillow had dropped, so she quickly pulled out the distraction and tossed it on the ground. She slipped the pistol out of her skirt's waistband and crept around the trees, moving closer to the manor. From across the way in another patch of trees, she noticed a movement. Fear tightened her throat as she recognized the scar-faced man. He, too, held a gun. The man had his sights on something around the side of the house. She stepped around trees, trying to see what he did, but when she heard Denton's voice, her heart dropped. She couldn't let the man kill Denton. 10. Denton strolled through the manicured lawn with the cook and the butler. Denton had started out praising the two for being such loyal servants and then offering his sympathy over their employer's loss. It was his plan to gain their trust. "Surely, you must have overheard something," he said to them, looking at the butler. Tibbs would have heard more than Mrs. Jackson, mainly because the cook stayed in the kitchen. The older man dabbed his moist eyes with a handkerchief. "After I let Miss Mills in the manor, I went outside to talk to Joseph in the stables." Denton stopped, and the other two followed suit. "Tibbs, did you hear anything before Miss Mills arrived?" The butler narrowed his gaze. "Why would I have heard anything then?" Denton sighed heavily but feeling more frustrated than anything. "Because I don't think Miss Mills killed Mr. Greenwood." The cook gasped. "Then who else could it have been?" Denton looked at the plump woman with an apron tied around her waist. She tucked a salt and pepper-colored lock of hair behind her ear. "Are you saying that one of the servants killed him?" Denton shook his head. "I'm not sure who killed him either. It is one of the servants or his own children, but I can guarantee you that Miss Mills is innocent." The dedicated servants exchanged worried glances. Tibbs' expression hardened, and sadness coated Mrs. Jackson's eyes. "If you know anything that might help me, I'd appreciate it if you tell me." "You don't understand," Mr. Tibbs whispered, "even if we knew, we can't say." "Henry, shush." Mrs. Jackson snapped. Denton's hopes lifted. Finally, he found a touchy subject, one that might get him some answers. "Please, Mrs. Jackson. Both of you loved Mr. Greenwood, so now he needs you to help find his killer. We cannot let an innocent woman go to jail for a crime she didn't commit. Mr. Greenwood would want you to help me." Frowning, the older woman glanced down at her hands as she twisted them against her round belly. "Mr. Reed," Mr. Tibbs said again, in quiet tones, "if Henrietta and I want to keep our jobs, we must make Albert's children believe that we trust them, and then in return, they can trust us." Denton touched the man's shoulder. "But Mr. Tibbs, don't you believe Albert deserves to have justice served for his killer?" He paused and then added, "If you tell me what you know, I promise that you won't lose your positions." "We fear for our own lives," the cook said brokenly. Denton's heart wrenched. "If you tell me who killed Albert, I'll make sure that person is locked away so that they can't harm another person." He patted the cook's arm. "Was it Miss Louise?" She wiped away the tears gathering in her eyes. That girl has always had a fierce temper when she doesn't get her way. But no, she did not kill her father. Clive? Denton prodded. It was Terence. Mr. Tibbs took a shaky breath. Shock washed over Denton as he turned to face the butler. His stomach churned fiercely, and he wanted to throw up. No. How could his good friend do something like that, to his father, of all people? Are you certain? Mr. Tibbs nodded as his frown deepened. I saw him go into Albert's study an hour before Miss Mills arrived. I heard them yelling, mainly Terence. Do you know? Denton's voice choked with emotion, so he cleared his throat and started over. Do you know what they were arguing about? The will. Tibbs rubbed his clean-shaven chin. The only two children who weren't losing money were Wallace and Patricia. Terence wanted his inheritance, but Albert refused. He told Terence that as soon as he married Miss Mills, his will would go into effect, and none of the children would get a penny. Tears filled his eyes. I heard Terence yell at his father, and the next thing I heard was someone falling to the floor. Denton tried holding back his own emotion as his heart continued to crumble over what his friend had done. Did Terence know you had heard? Tibbs nodded. Terence threatened me that if I said anything, he'd make sure I never worked as a butler again. He shrugged. I didn't know whether he meant that he was going to kill me, or just ruin my reputation, but either way, I didn't want to cross that man. Denton inhaled a shaky breath, trying to gain control over his emotions. Does Clive or Louise know it was Terence? Both the butler and cook shrugged. I think, Mrs. Jackson said, that Terence planted into their heads the idea of it being Miss Mills, and since nobody liked her, it was easier to believe she killed Albert. All right, then Terence acted alone. He glanced at Tibbs. And you said Terence has gone to Stumptown? Yes. Then, I shall get him and arrest him. Denton squeezed the older man's elbow reassuringly. I won't let him get away with this. Thank you, Mr. Reed. A tear slid down the man's face. Now, you two better get back inside before Clive or Louise notices you out here talking to me. Both of them acted very suspiciously when I talked to them, so I don't want them doubting your trust. The servants turned toward the house. Suddenly, a gunshot blasted through the air, followed quickly by another one, breaking nature's peacefulness. Pain exploded in his body. His heart dropped. I've been shot. He crumbled to the ground. Courtney's hands shook as she held the still-smoking pistol. She was too late. When the scar-faced man had pointed his gun at Denton, she aimed her gun at him, but his trigger finger was much faster than hers. Thankfully, though, the bullet from her gun had found its target, and the scar-faced man had fallen to the ground. She ran toward Denton as tears swam in her eyes. The cook and butler were attending Denton, but she couldn't see what was going on. As she neared, she heard them talking to Denton, and her hope grew in her heart. Denton, she screamed as she reached them and fell to the ground beside him. His eyes were open, and he clutched his left shoulder. The cook's apron had been wadded up and placed against the wound to help stop blood flow. Miss Mills, Mr. Tibbs exclaimed in surprise. What are you? Will he be all right? She asked, cutting him off. Courtney, Denton said in a tight voice, I'll be fine. Just take me to a doctor so that he can remove the bullet. You aren't going anywhere, the cook said in a commanding voice. I'll have Joseph ride out and bring back the doctor. Courtney nodded. And have him bring the sheriff too. Why? Denton asked. Because Miss Louise hired the man who shot you, and she needs to be arrested. I witnessed the exchange. Denton tried to sit up, but Courtney placed her hand on his chest, trying to hold him down. Don't move. It'll only make you bleed faster. Courtney, where is the man who shot me? She motioned her head toward the group of trees. In there. I shot him. Is he dead? Denton asked. I don't know, but he fell to the ground. I was more worried about seeing to your welfare than worrying about him. Mr. Tibbs grasped Courtney's gun and stood. I'll go check on him first, and then have Joseph fetch the doctor and sheriff. Thank you, Mr. Tibbs. He gave her a gentle smile. Welcome back, Miss Mills. Tears filled her eyes again as she looked back at Denton. Besides Albert, Mr. Tibbs and Mrs. Jackson were the only servants who treated her kindly. She prayed they would both be well taken care of. Where did he shoot you? She asked Denton in a cracked voice. The tip of my shoulder. It's burning, but at least I'll live. She nodded. I tried to shoot him before he could get to you first, but... Courtney, he said as he struggled to smile, you did all you could do. I'm proud of you. Her heart softened. I'm glad the bullet from your pistol knew how to find its target because my body was trembling so badly, I didn't know if I could hit him or not. A few more servants came from the house to see what the commotion was about. With Mr. Tibbs gone, Mrs. Jackson issued instructions, and soon, several of the stable hands had lifted Denton and helped him into the house. They carried him into the kitchen and placed him on the floor. Mrs. Jackson hurried to gather more towels and water. The men helped to remove Denton's coat, vest, and shirt. Courtney quickly looked away, not wanting to see the blood. But, curiosity had gotten the best of her, and she peeked over her shoulder. Instead of seeing his wound, she saw a muscular man with a wide, bare chest. Oh, my. She averted her gaze again. This was not very proper at all. Then again, she'd been with Denton all this time, and nothing had been appropriate. She took his coat, holding it close to her chest, avoiding the blood on the sleeve. The smell of musk and spice enveloped her. Funny how she knew his mesmerizing scent by now. The high-pitched voice of Louise echoed through the house, growing louder by the second. Courtney's first reaction was to hide, but then, anger took over, and she wanted to punish the woman for what she'd done. What is going on? Louise's loud gasp filled the kitchen. Why is Mr. Reed on the floor, and bleeding? The servants parted the way for her, like Moses parting the Red Sea. Take him out of here, she demanded. This is not the place. He's staying right here. Mrs. Jackson puffed her chest and lifted her chin stubbornly as she glared at Louise. He will not be moved until the doctor arrives and gives further instructions. Oh, how dare you talk to me like that? Louise folded her arms across her chest. If you don't watch it, I'll have you dismissed in a blink of an eye. Courtney had enough of the other woman's higher-than-thou attitude. As she moved Denton's coat to set it aside, she felt something heavy in one of the inside pockets. She reached her hand inside. Her fingers brushed against cold steel, handcuffs. She quickly withdrew them, smiling. It was time to let Miss Louise know that she is no longer in control around here. And if you do that to the cook, Courtney said, moving toward Louise, I can have you thrown in jail so fast it'll make your head spin. Louise glared. Who are you, and what right do you have to tell me that in my own home? Her gaze moved over Courtney. Aren't you the pregnant woman by the hotel? No, she pulled off her wig, and gasps exploded in the room, coming from the servants, but mainly from Louise. I'm the person who is going to arrest you. She held up the handcuffs. Louise snorted a laugh. You should be the one arrested for killing my father. No, she won't. Denton struggled to sit up as he threw Louise a glare. I won't arrest someone who is innocent. However, you, Miss Louise, are guilty of conspiracy to plot a murder. Louise huffed. I don't know what you're talking about. Courtney stepped closer. You certainly do. I saw, and heard, you talking to the scar-faced man by the saloon in town. You knew I was there because you saw me. She arched an eyebrow. And you gave the man money and told him to kill Denton. You can't prove anything. I can. Courtney motioned toward the window. The man is outside, shot, and probably bleeding to death. And I bet if the sheriff goes out there now, he'll find a money bag on the man's person, with your perfume scent all over it. Louise's face paled. I don't believe you. Courtney, Denton said. Place those handcuffs on Louise until the sheriff arrives. Grinning widely, Courtney couldn't wait to see the defeat in the woman's eyes. Instead, she saw panic. Louise pushed Courtney and started to run, but the servants who had once parted were now moving in a cluster to keep their mistress from running. Courtney closed the space between her and the other woman, and grasped Louise's wrists and slapped on the handcuffs, the same way she'd witnessed Denton do it with the bank robbers. When Courtney looked back at Denton, he smiled at her with pride in his gaze. Once again, her heart skipped a beat. How could she not love this man? She only prayed that he felt the same way about her. Another thing she quickly prayed for was that when the sheriff arrived, that Denton could convince him not to arrest her. Hopefully, they'd be able to tell the man of the law what they knew so that the right people were put in jail. 11. Denton's shoulder would ache like the dickens, but he'd survive. It wasn't the first time he'd been shot, and it wouldn't be the last. However, what made this time so special was that he had someone to share it with. Courtney wouldn't leave his side, even when the doctor removed the bullet, bandaged his arm, and they rode back to the hotel. Never before had Denton been with someone who'd cared that much about him when he was shot. Then again, he was always shot on the job, and because of his profession, he didn't know many people. After the doctor left their hotel room, Courtney arranged for the hotel to bring them up some food. Now, she sat on the bed next to him, helping him eat. Every time he tried to lift his left arm, she'd playfully scold him and tell him to be still. After he took a couple of bites from his stew and swallowed, he smiled. You know, Courtney, I am right-handed. I can eat by myself. She cocked her head and gave him a teasing smile. But you also lost a lot of blood, and Dr. Patrick did say to take things easy for the rest of the day. Yes, he said rest. He didn't say, don't move. She chuckled and scooped up another spoonful of stew. Well, Mr. Reed, you're going to have to allow me to help you. Why? Because I like it. She slid the spoon inside his mouth. It pleased him that she enjoyed taking care of him. He chewed the stew and swallowed. I'm sure the sheriff will be here any time now. She nodded. There's no use to try and hide. I'm sure Louise told him we're together. I had wished the doctor wouldn't have taken us back here. I wanted to explain things to the sheriff. I know, but I trust Mr. Tibbs and Mrs. Jackson will take care of things. They will, but the case still hasn't been solved. Courtney frowned. What do you mean? Louise paid that man. Yes, she had paid him to kill me. But Louise mentioned that if he messed things up this time, she'd kill him personally. She shrugged. That made me think that she had paid the man to kill her father, too. That would be the logical way of thinking. However, Mr. Tibbs confessed to hearing what happened when Albert was killed. Her eyes widened. He did? Denton's heart wrenched again, thinking about his friend. It was Terrence. She gasped and covered her hand over her mouth. No, she muttered, shaking her head. First thing in the morning, I'll be riding to Stumptown to arrest him. No, you won't. She gave him a stubborn expression. We will ride to Stumptown. He chuckled. The sheriff might come with us. I don't mind, just as long as he doesn't try to arrest me. I won't let him. I'll shoot him myself if he tries. Her shoulders relaxed, and she placed her hand on his chest. Why are you so kind to me? He shrugged. Because I have a kind heart. Yes, you do, but, is that all? Denton held his breath. What was she trying to get him to say? Confessing his feelings to her had been on the tip of his tongue since right after he was shot, but he didn't dare. He knew he had been caught up in the moment of her trying to save his life. Yet, he couldn't stop the erratic beat of his heart whenever he looked into her beautiful grayish-blue eyes. And, when she touched him as she was doing now, her touch burned through his skin into his blood and warmed his whole body. Because I know, he answered, that you're not guilty. I've always tracked down criminals, and you, my dear Miss Mills, are not a criminal. She sighed and smiled, but the gesture didn't reach her eyes. No, I'm not a criminal. Her gaze dropped to the bowl of stew as she scooped another spoonful. His emotions twisted, seeing the pain in her eyes. Oh, why was he so weak around her? If he told her his feelings now, he'd be vulnerable, and helpless men didn't make good bounty hunters. Yet, he hated to see her this way. He hated the confusion filling him at this moment. Courtney. He touched her hand, stopping her from lifting the spoon to his mouth. It's actually more than that. Her eyes widened in anticipation. I like you, and, oh, good grief. He needed to rein in his emotions. I'm kind to those I really like. She laughed lightly. I really like you, too. It was on the tip of his tongue to tell her the truth, but then someone knocked on the door, breaking the mood between them. Courtney left the bed and set the bowl and spoon on the table before opening the door. Miss Mills. Sheriff Smith doffed his cowboy hat and nodded. I was told Mr. Reed is here. She stepped back and motioned for him to enter. She pointed toward the bed. Denton waited for the sheriff to say something about Courtney being here, but the lawman didn't. It relieved Denton to know that Mr. Tibbs and Mrs. Jackson must have talked to him and let him know what really happened. Welcome, Sheriff, Denton greeted. I wondered when you'd drop by. The tall man released a heavy breath and ran his fingers through his hair. You left me a mess to clean up at the Greenwood estate. Denton carefully rubbed his bandaged shoulder. I would have done that, but I was injured. He paused and then asked, how is the scarred man who shot me? He won't die, but he lost a lot of blood. Apparently, nobody wanted to tend to his wound as they tended to you. If you ask me, Courtney said, moving to a chair near the bed and sitting, the man didn't deserve our help. He was out to kill Mr. Reed, and I don't feel sorry for him at all. Sheriff Smith looked at her. I'm told you are the one who shot him. I am. She straightened her shoulders. And if he tries to kill Denton again, I'll happily shoot the man again. Denton grinned, and his love grew for this special lady. I did as Mr. Tibbs and Mrs. Jackson requested. I kept Miss Louise handcuffed to the chair and went to check on the man you shot. He shrugged. You were right. He had a bag full of gold coins, and the bag was monogrammed with Miss Louise's initials, and smelled of her perfume. Courtney beamed. That's wonderful. I'm glad he still had the money on his person. The servants also told me that you witnessed the exchange between him and Miss Louise. I did. His mouth tightened as he scratched his neck. I'm having a hard time believing that you saw this. Why? Denton snapped, anger filling him quickly. Because you had run from a murder scene, which makes you look guilty. Panic crossed Courtney's expression, and her face paled slightly. If you had been forced to marry someone so much older than you, and then ridiculed and hated by that person's children, then you found that person dead. You would be smart enough to know that if you didn't get out of there, you'd be arrested for a crime you didn't commit. Denton closed his mouth, realizing he couldn't have said it any better. He studied the sheriff, and thankfully, the man appeared to be on Courtney's side. Denton could only hope. Sheriff, Denton said, I don't know if Louise had anything to do with her father's death, but according to Mr. Tibbs, he knows who the killer is. The sheriff sighed again and scrubbed his face with the palms of his hands. I cannot accept that it was Terrence. He shook his head. I've never known him to have a mean bone in his body. Denton thought back over his memories with Terrence, and although a few times the man had become upset, it never escalated into anything violent. It's difficult for me to accept, as well. He is my good friend. But Mr. Tibbs saw Terrence enter Albert's study, and they quarreled. Tibbs heard the thud of Albert's body crumbling to the floor, and then Terrence leaving. And let's not forget that Terrence threatened Tibbs that if he said anything, he'd ruin him, or worse. Yes. Tibbs is a respected man who was loyal to Albert Greenwood. Then I suggest, Denton said, we travel to Stumptown tomorrow and find him. Sheriff Smith motioned to Denton's bandaged arm. Are you going to feel like riding that far? Terrence is my friend. I want to get the truth out of him. His father's death needs to be solved soon. The sheriff nodded. Then, we'll leave at sunrise. 12. Courtney tried to be strong for Denton, but riding astride on a horse wearing men's trousers and a long overcoat, to cover her curvy womanly figure was almost more than she could bear. Even the hat the sheriff made her wear, after pulling her long hair into a ponytail, had made her more uncomfortable. If not for the moisture gathering around her hairline, the only good purpose for this hat was to keep the sun off her face. Bonnets did the same thing, except she'd never nearly sweated to death while wearing one. Yet, that was the deal she'd made with Denton and the sheriff if she wanted to go along with them during the long journey. She clenched her teeth and didn't complain. The truth was, she'd not been brought up to ride a horse astride or wear men's clothes. Her parents would be fainting dead away if they saw her now, or they'd probably disown her. At long last, they arrived in Stumptown, population 320. Helena was much bigger than this town, yet she already liked the small town feeling's coziness. They rode toward the lake. As she spied the people on the streets, she realized she didn't see many women. Perhaps this was another reason Denton and the sheriff made her dress in men's clothes. She urged her horse closer to Denton. He looked at her and smiled. "What do you think of Stumptown? It's an odd name, but I do like it." However, she glanced around once more. "I don't see many women." The sheriff chuckled. "Not many live here. This is a logging town, and there isn't much room for fashionable women. They don't belong in places like this." She scowled at the sheriff. "That's ridiculous. Every town needs women. You'll find a few, my dear Courtney." Denton winked. "But very few." Courtney didn't know if she liked the sheriff's attitude about women not belonging in a logging town. Men still had desires, and she was sure that some of them wanted families, too. The flash of a calico dress caught Courtney's attention, and she swung her gaze toward the mercantile. A lovely woman, probably around the same age as Courtney, walked out, carrying a basket. Her belly was round with child. The woman had the prettiest dark brown hair Courtney had ever seen. The woman's gaze briefly met Courtney's, but then switched back to her wagon as she set her full basket on the seat. Suddenly, the woman's gaze jumped back to Courtney as her eyes widened. Courtney held her breath. Her first thought was that the woman had noticed Courtney from the newspaper article, but then, she'd hoped that the newspaper hadn't reached this far northwest. Slowly, a smile touched the woman's face, and she raised a hand in greeting. Courtney gasped quietly. The woman must recognize another woman in town, even if she wasn't dressed like one. Courtney waved back at the woman, relieved to be seen as a lady and not a man. She hoped men wouldn't notice. Then again, only women noticed things like that. Courtney looked ahead and noticed Denton looking at her with an arched eyebrow. "A friend of yours?" he asked. "No," she smiled. "The lady was just waving at visitors, I suppose." He stared at her for a few moments, and his grin widened. "You should smile more." "What an odd statement." She gave him a suspicious look. "Why would you say that?" "Because your face brightens, and your eyes sparkle like gems." Her cheeks heated, and she was sure her whole face was aflame with embarrassment. "You shouldn't say such things out in public." He laughed. "Why not? You're absolutely adorable." "Well, because I'm dressed like a man, and I don't think you'd want anyone overhearing you talk that way to another man." Denton's laugh grew louder. "Point taken, my dear." They didn't talk again until they grew closer to the lake. Denton motioned his hand toward the large sawmill. "Let's stop there. I know the owner. I'll see if he has spoken with Terrence." The sheriff looked at Denton and cocked his head. "Does your friend know Terrence?" "I don't know, but Terrence is a hard man to miss. His height and deep auburn hair makes him unforgettable." They brought their horses to a halt and dismounted. Denton turned to help Courtney down, but she held up her hand, stopping him. "I'm supposed to be a man, remember?" she whispered. Nodding, Denton chuckled and backed away. "Sheriff, keep an eye on her." "I'll be right back." Once Denton walked up the wooden porch and into the building, Courtney slowly moved away from her horse. Her legs ached, and her bottom felt bruised. Oh, heavens, how was she going to get back home now? She almost hoped they didn't find Terrence right away and that they would have to stay in Stumptown. The hotel they'd passed looked like a decent place to stay. And so far, the town was nice. For a moment, she pictured herself living here, with Denton as her husband, of course. They would have 4 or 5 children. She wanted more boys than girls, only because she wanted them to look just like their father. Sighing, she leaned against her horse. She really shouldn't do this to herself. Although she'd tried to get Denton to tell her how he felt, all he could say was that he liked her. That didn't tell her much at all. Courtney rubbed her forehead. Perhaps she would have to be the one to say it first. Then, maybe, just maybe, he would have the same feelings for her. A man couldn't kiss as passionately as he had without having his heart involved. Or could he? 13. The noise from the saws in the back of the building was overwhelmingly loud. Denton was sure the saws weren't going all the time. A person could become deaf from hearing that day after day. He walked from one aisle to the other but didn't see his friend, Brian Easton. The Easton family was probably the wealthiest in Stumptown, but only because the brothers' grandfather owned many of the sawmills and the logging camp. Thankfully, the old man allowed his 3 grandsons to run things. Brian was the oldest, then Joel, and Maverick was the youngest. The last time Denton had talked to Brian, Maverick had married a lovely lady, who apparently was supposed to be Brian's mail-order bride. Denton chuckled. What an odd story that was. But Brian admitted that he wasn't ready for a wife and that Maverick and Hannah were perfect together. Finally, the saws in the back stopped running, and Denton listened for any sign of the workers. After a few moments, he called, "Brian Easton?" The floor squeaked as the shuffling of footsteps was heard from the back room, growing louder as they came closer. A tall man with sandy brown hair held a box against his chest. Sawdust coated the man's hair and mustache. His eyes widened, and he grinned. "Reed? Is that you?" Denton smiled and walked toward his friend. Being a bounty hunter, he made sure to make friends in almost every town he visited. He and Brian had been friends for 4 years. "Yes, it's me." Brian set the box on the counter and moved toward Denton, brushing his hands along his sawdusted-covered clothes. When he reached Denton, the 2 men shook hands. "What in the blazes are you doing in Stumptown?" "I'm on a case." Brian rolled his eyes. "You never come out to just visit anymore." Denton laughed heartily. "Maybe one day, I will. I'm actually thinking of finding a small town to settle down in soon." Brian motioned his hand toward the window. "Stumptown is small." "You're right. It is. And we could certainly use a man like you here." Denton's curiosity rose. "What would you have me doing?" "The town needs a good sheriff. The one we have now is, well, he's old and decrepit." Denton couldn't believe how the idea rooted in his mind and expanded in his chest with enthusiasm. "Let me think about it. But, for now, I'm trying to find someone. His name is Terrence Greenwood, and I was told he was coming here to meet with someone about buying a fishing boat. He's tall with red hair." "A fishing boat, eh?" Brian scratched behind his ear, and then must have realized he had sawdust in his hair, so he quickly brushed it off. Denton pointed to his upper lip, hoping his friend would know what he was saying. Laughing, Brian brushed the sawdust off his mustache. "What can I say? It comes with my job." Denton nodded. "I don't mind at all." "So, Mr. Greenwood came to talk to someone about a fishing boat?" "That would probably be Alan Cartwright. He owns a boat shop." "And where can I find him?" Brian walked to the window, and Denton followed. "Do you see that gray building?" "Yes." "Past that and keep going down the slope, and you'll see another building. Alan's name, Cartwright, will be written in big, bold letters on the sign. You can't miss it. By chance, have you seen a man fitting that description walking around town?" Brian nodded. "In fact, I have. This morning, actually. He walked by the mill. I can now only assume he was heading toward the boat shop." "Great." Denton clapped his friend on the shoulder. "I appreciate your help. How long will you be in town?" Maybe you and I can meet later for some dinner at Boyd's Diner. That sounds good, but I'm here with the sheriff of Helena, and my woman friend. Brian's eyes grew large, and a silly grin touched his mouth. You have a woman friend? He chuckled. I never thought that day would come. We are just friends. Denton didn't know why he had to lie. Well, it really wasn't a lie, but until the case was solved, they would only be friends. Brian punched Denton in the arm playfully. That is how relationships start, don't you know? I'll have to bow out on the dinner. But I promise to think about the offer of making Stumptown my home. You had better, my friend. With your experience, you would make a reliable and trustworthy sheriff. As Denton left the sawmill, a smile stretched across his face. Images popped into his head, and he could envision himself as the town's sheriff, with his lovely wife next to him, supporting him in his position. And the gorgeous face of his lovely wife was Courtney's. It was a nice dream. Now the question was, would it ever become a reality? Denton rode toward Alan Cartwright's boat shop. He told the sheriff and Courtney to stay back in hiding. Terrence couldn't know that Denton had brought the lawman with him. He needed his friend to be oblivious to the reason Denton was in town. He just hoped his murderous friend was still at the boat shop and hadn't already noticed Denton and the sheriff riding through town. He reached the shop and walked in through the front double doors. Men's voices were heard, but Denton couldn't tell which direction they were coming from because of the echo. Several wooden canoes and rafts were displayed, and some were still being built. The tools of the tradesmen were hanging on the walls. Denton continued walking through the building until the voices grew louder. Then he recognized Terrence. The man's height and red hair were easy to detect. Terrence was talking to another man who appeared to be one of the workers at the shop by the way he was dressed. The conversation between the two men didn't look pleasant at all. Terrence's face was red, and as he spoke, he moved his arms wildly around. Slowing his steps, he listened intently, but the echoing made it almost impossible to hear anything. He detected the phrases "you owe me," and "no more deals," from the boat worker. Terrence said something to the effect of "this time it'll work, and you'll be sorry." Whatever kind of deal the two arguing men were trying to make, Denton felt it wasn't good. He had a feeling Terrence was trying to convince the man to give him money, and the man refused. His movement must have captured the boat worker's attention because the man snapped his gaze toward Denton. That, of course, made Terrence turn and look. Anger was the man's first expression, and when he noticed Denton, his whole countenance changed, as if Terrence was two different people. Denton highly suspected the man led a double life. That could be the only explanation as to why Terrence felt the need to kill his father. Denton Reed. Terrence smiled and walked toward him. What a surprise it is to see you here. Denton shook hands with his friend and tried not to let his feelings show because Terrence would be suspicious. I heard from your father's servants that you had traveled here, and they didn't know when you would return. Terrence's eyes widened. Do you have news of Miss Mills? That's why I'm here. Denton tried smiling, but it wasn't easy. Do you think we can talk privately? Yes. Terrence turned back to the other man. We'll finish our business later. The middle-aged man huffed, turned, and walked away. Denton could read people well enough to know that this man didn't want to finish their business later. Terrence followed Denton outside, but they stayed near the front of the building. Have you arrested Miss Mills yet? Terrence asked with entirely too much excitement. No, I haven't. Terrence scowled. Then tell me you found the person who murdered my father. I think I have found that person, but it's not Miss Mills. Growling, Terrence bunched his hands into fists and paced the ground. Of course, it's her. She is the only one who had any reason to kill him. Perhaps, but because she isn't strong enough to lift the marble bust of George Washington and whack it over your father's head, that right there tells me she's not the killer. Terrence stopped and glared at Denton. What are you talking about? Our killer must be strong enough to pick up the bust, lift it high enough over their head, and have the strength to bring it down hard and hit it over someone's head. Denton sighed. Miss Mills isn't that strong. Your sister, Louise, is stronger than Courtney, and even your sister couldn't lift the bust that high. Denton studied the man's eyes. A hint of panic laced his brown eyes, and Denton prayed it wouldn't be difficult to arrest this man. Fine, then Miss Mills didn't do it. So, who did? Slowly, Denton expelled a breath as he began pacing. After ruling out Miss Mills and your sister, I did some checking around, and I discovered that the person who killed Albert Greenwood was after his money. Terence snorted a laugh, sounding very much like Louise when she did that. His money? Are you joking? Denton stopped and met his friend's gaze. Not at all. In fact, after I had come to this conclusion, I realized I had 3 more suspects. In order to weed out the killer, I dug deeper and even visited with your father's lawyer. He paused, waiting for his friend's reaction. Just as Denton expected, panic was the emotion on the man's expression now. Do I want to know what you concluded? Terence asked in a tight voice, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. Denton folded his arms. Why did you do it, Terence? Was getting your inheritance important enough to kill your father? Terence laughed forcefully. Me? You think I killed him? No, Denton paused briefly. I don't think you killed him. I know you did. You're wrong. I didn't do it. My sister should be the one arrested. She was the one who hired a man to kill our father. Denton nodded. I'd suspected that was the case. However, I also note that the man she hired did not go through with his assignment. I'm guessing it's because you had interrupted him. Shaking his head slowly, Terence's gaze wandered around the empty road in front of the boat shop. Denton stayed alert, preparing for anything to happen. Terence huffed. I cannot believe you doubt your good friend. I suppose you have your mind set and nothing can change it. Denton wondered what game Terence was trying to play with him now. What I can't believe is that my good friend would think I was a fool not to suspect you, considering this is what I do for a living. You're wrong, Denton. Terence turned and entered the shop quickly. Denton had a strong feeling he knew what was coming next and hurried inside to finally bring this long-awaited showdown to an end. 14. Courtney ignored the aches in her legs as she concentrated on watching Denton and Terence. She and the sheriff hid behind 2 large trees, just as Denton had requested. But now she wished she had a gun, if only to have something in her hands to keep them occupied. Her nerves were already jumping, and once Denton and Terence walked back into the building, she thought her quaking nerves would make her scream with frustration. Why did they go back inside? She whispered to the sheriff. I don't know, and I don't like it. What should we do? The sheriff swung his attention to her. You should stay here. I will go inside. But Denton told us to stay out here. Yes, but because I'm his backup, and I can't see him, I need to get closer. Then I'm coming with you. The sheriff threw her a glare. No, you're not. Going inside will only put you in the line of fire. You are staying here, Miss Mills, and I don't want to hear any argument from you. Courtney gritted her teeth. She wouldn't argue, but neither would she sit idle. The sheriff crept away from the tree he'd been hiding behind, and made his way toward the building, holding a gun in his hand. When he reached the side of the building, he flattened himself up against the wall and scooted toward the closest window. It took him a few times to peek inside and then withdraw quickly before he switched directions and snuck around toward the back. Once the sheriff was out of sight, Courtney searched the ground until she found a tree limb that was thick enough to hit someone with, but not too large that she couldn't lift it. Using the tree limb as her weapon, she darted from one tree to another, trying to stay hidden as she moved closer to the building. Suddenly, she saw a movement from the other side of the building. Her body froze as she pushed herself up against the tree for coverage. After a few seconds passed, she dared to take a peek. When she recognized Terence hurrying away from the building as if the devil was on his heels, Courtney's heart dropped. Denton was hurt, and she prayed that the sheriff would help him because she was going after Terence. Her mind pictured David and Goliath's Bible story, her being David, and Terence, the larger man. Yet, she had David's faith that the Lord would help her stop Terence. Justice must prevail. Since the tall man was on foot, she knew he'd not be able to get too far from her. Although he ran, she would follow him. Terrence headed for the nearby woods, which was where she had been hiding. She suspected he wanted to hide away as well. She stayed behind a tree until he was well enough in front of her before she started following. She moved behind one tree to the next, keeping a good pace as she trailed Terrence. Every so often, he'd stop and look behind him. She was slender enough to hide behind these trees, thankfully. However, there weren't many thick trunks where he could hide. His movements were slower. Courtney suspected he was out of breath. Although her legs were screaming at her to stop, determination to catch the killer was what kept her going. She might not have been in love with Albert, but she wanted to do this last thing for him by helping to catch the older man's killer. She kept a prayer in her heart the deeper into the woods they ran. The sun was dipping in the horizon, and soon it would be dark. Once that happened, she'd be in big trouble, especially if nobody came looking for her. Suddenly, Terrence stopped and spun her way. The movement was too quick, and she didn't have time to jump behind a tree. "Who are you?" Terrence asked in a loud voice. "Why are you following me?" Courtney could only assume he thought she was a man, since she still wore the large overcoat and cowboy hat, and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. However, when she answered him, he'd know she was a woman. "I can't let you get away, Terrence Greenwood." He widened his eyes. "Who are you?" She yanked off her hat and tossed it to the ground. Tightening her fingers around the tree limb, she stepped closer to him, keeping her gaze locked with his. "I'm the one you tried to blame for your father's murder." "Miss Mills?" His gaze swept over her. "How did you know I was here?" "I came with Denton Reed." Terrence's expression relaxed, and he let out a loud laugh. "And you think you're going to catch me?" She nodded. "Or die trying." "Then, let me suggest, Miss Mills, that you prepare for a quick death because I'm not going to let anyone arrest me." "You'll not win, Terrence Greenwood." "I have so far." He grinned victoriously. "Denton Reed is lying unconscious just inside the boat shop. As soon as he walked inside, I hit him in the head with a paddle." Courtney's heart clenched as her worry escalated. But she must keep the faith that God would watch over him, or that God would help the sheriff to take care of Denton. "Then I suppose it's just you and me." "Yes, it is." Terrence's gaze narrowed on her as he walked forward. Her heartbeat quickened in fear, but she held strong. "Please, Lord, guide me." His hand slid in the pocket of his long overcoat, and he withdrew a pistol. Her heart sank. His weapon had bullets that killed. Her weapon just knocked people out. The odds weren't looking promising. Suddenly, that snapping noise of steel hitting a bone echoed through the forest. Terrence screamed in pain and dropped to the ground, grasping the animal trap that was now securing his foot. Cussing loudly, he tried to peel the steel claws of the trap off his foot, but to no avail. Once the shock wore off, she searched the ground for his gun, but because of the leaves covering the earth's floor and the shadows forming everywhere, she couldn't see it. Immediately, the thought came to her, knock him out. She wanted to believe this was the Lord helping her, so she hurried behind Terrence and whacked the tree limb against his head. Seconds later, he fell to the ground, unconscious. Courtney took deep breaths to calm herself, and at the same time, said a silent prayer of thanks for his help. She wouldn't have been able to do it without him. She quickly searched the ground for Terrence's gun and breathed a sigh of relief when she found it. Now, when Terrence awoke, he wouldn't have any weapon. Then again, he was rather stuck, anyway. From not too far off, she heard someone calling her name. She spun around and peered through the dense forest, but she couldn't see anything because of the shadows. "I'm here." As she studied the direction where the voices were coming from, she noticed a light. Someone had come to rescue her. Courtney? This time she recognized the voice, and she sobbed with happiness. "Denton, I'm over here." As soon as she saw him, she broke into a run, calling out his name. Her heart burst with gladness. When she reached him, he wrapped her in a tight hug, burying his face in her neck. "You are all right," she exclaimed brokenly. "Terrence said he'd hit you." I thought I'd lost you. Never, my love. Denton lifted his head from her neck, but then he pressed his lips against hers. She answered back eagerly, kissing him fast but passionately. She couldn't stop. It was too satisfying to know he was alive and that he wanted to kiss her, as well. All right, you two, the sheriff said with a touch of humor in his voice. You have plenty of time for that later. Let's take Mr. Greenwood back to town first, and then you two can be lovey-dovey. Denton broke the kiss, but he kept his arm around her waist as he turned toward Terrence's still form. What happened here? She shrugged. I just imagined that Terrence was my Goliath, and I overcame my obstacle. She glanced up at the sky. Thanks to divine intervention. Another man that she hadn't noticed before stepped past her and Denton, holding a lantern. He stopped by Terrence's body and chuckled. It's good to see my brother's traps are still catching animals. Courtney, Denton grinned, I want you to meet a good friend of mine. This is Brian Easton. She gave him her best smile. Nice to meet you, Mr. Easton. The man nodded. It's a pleasure to meet the woman who broke the mold. Mr. Easton gave Denton a wink before he knelt beside the sheriff and they pulled apart the animal trap. It didn't take long before the sheriff handcuffed Terrence and woke the man up from his short, but most likely, painful slumber. The criminal groaned and whined about his injured foot, but he was still able to limp back through the forest toward town with very little help. The sheriff kept a grasp on the man's arm, although Terrence argued about his innocence the whole way. Denton and Courtney followed behind, still with their arms around each other's waist. She enjoyed being this cozy with him. Why is Terrence going on about his innocence even though we know the truth? Denton kissed her forehead. Criminals do that. For some reason, they think they can talk their way out of it. However, in Terrence's instance, we already have a witness. He won't be able to get out of this one, no matter how much sweet-talking he does. Tilting back her head, she peered up at him. Even though night had fallen around them, and the lantern didn't bring much light to his face, she had every curve memorized. She remembered how one side of his mouth lifted higher than the other when he smiled, and the dimple on his cheek would deepen. His green eyes would sparkle whenever he gazed at her, and when he kissed her, his eyes would turn a lighter color. No, she didn't need light to know what he looked like right now. Denton? What did Mr. Easton mean when he mentioned that I broke the mold? Denton chuckled. Well, my lovely Courtney, Brian never thought I'd find a woman who would make me want to settle down. When I mentioned you today while I was talking to him at the sawmill, he realized that I have indeed found that woman. Her heartbeat stilled for a moment as shock rushed over her. You have found that woman in me? He stopped and faced her, wrapping both arms around her. Courtney Mills, I've fallen in love with you, and for reasons I cannot explain, I find myself wanting to settle down and take on a regular job in a small town. I want to marry you and have children with you, Anne. I want a normal life. Tears filled her eyes, and she nodded. Oh, Denton. She threw her arms around his neck and leaned closer. I want to be your wife. I've thought of nothing else since our first kiss. She kissed him briefly. I'm so much in love with you, Denton Reed, and I can't imagine my life without you. What about Timothy Graham? Who? As soon as she asked, the memory hit her, and she groaned. Oh, you mean the man who is looking for a mail-order bride? Yes. You did tell him you were accepting his offer. She frowned. Yes, but I only did it because I wanted to leave Montana. But now I want to be with the man I love. It'll make me feel better if you send him another telegram and let him know that you have found the love of your life. She nodded vigorously. As soon as we get back to town. He stroked the side of her face. What would you say to raising our children here in Stumptown? She laughed and nodded. I'd say, how soon can we get started? Epilogue. Denton couldn't believe how happy he'd been since falling in love with Courtney. Once they'd gotten back to Helena and had both Terrence and Louise behind bars, Denton took his bride-to-be, and they moved to Stumptown. He also brought Mr. Tibbs and Mrs. Jackson because Denton knew the older servants would be well cared for. Within 2 days, he and Courtney were married at the church, and 1 day later, he was standing in front of the mayor, with his lovely bride by his side, and his good friend, Brian Easton, on his other side. "Raise your right hand and place your left hand on the Bible," Mayor Tidwell said. Denton did as the man asked. "Repeat after me," the mayor continued. "I, Denton Reed, do solemnly affirm to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and the laws of Montana." Smiling wide, Denton repeated the words. "And I do further affirm that I will do everything in my power to keep the citizens of Stumptown safe and protected." Denton nodded, repeating the words. "As mayor of Stumptown, I officially appoint you sheriff." He pinned a gold star on Denton's vest. Once the mayor had stepped back, the small crowd gathered in the town hall applauded and cheered. Denton shook the mayor's hand, and then he turned to gather his wife in his arms and kiss her. Most of these people had seen him kiss her when they attended their wedding, and so he didn't care if they witnessed it again. After a few very enjoyable moments, he broke away so that he could shake hands with the others who were there. Brian gave him a big bear hug and then turned to introduce him to the others in the room. "Denton, meet my brother, Joel." Denton shook the man's hand. Joel resembled his older brother a lot, but his eyes were brown instead of blue. "And this is my younger brother, Maverick, and his wife, Hannah." Denton shook hands with them both. He realized Hannah was the woman who had smiled so kindly at Courtney the first time they'd ridden into town. And he also noticed by her round belly that Brian would become an uncle very soon. Courtney also shook hands with them, and within minutes, she and Hannah were strolling away from the men, chatting like long-lost friends. Denton grinned, loving how welcomed they felt here in Stumptown. "So, my good man," Maverick said, slapping Denton on the shoulder, "I think your first line of business should be officially appointing Hannah and myself the town's experienced matchmakers." The small group of men laughed heartily, and Denton shook his head. "I don't believe that's in my job description." "Then, you should make it." Maverick nodded assuredly. "Tell me, Mr. Easton." Denton rubbed his chin. "Why would you and Hannah want to become the town's matchmakers? Isn't that a job for lonely old ladies who have nothing better to do with their time?" Maverick chuckled. "Well, the truth is, after I met my wonderfully charming wife, Hannah, and I realized how happy I was with her, I knew I needed to make the other single men in our town just as happy." "By playing matchmaker?" Denton asked, hoping he understood the man's offer. "Exactly." Maverick folded his arms. "This town needs more women." Brian laughed heartily and elbowed his brother. "Yes, and maybe next time, you won't steal my bride-to-be." Joel shook his head. "Why do we need more women?" To be quite honest, Maverick lowered his voice and leaned in, making the conversation a little more private. "The reason I agreed with Hannah to become matchmakers with her was because I didn't want the other men in town ogling my beautiful wife all the time. I'm a jealous man, and I don't like men staring at her." Denton chuckled and glanced at his gorgeous bride. He knew that feeling very well. And, until they brought more women to Stumptown, he might have the same frustrations as Maverick. "You know," Denton said with authority, "I think I'll grant you that wish, Mr. Easton." He gave Maverick a nod. "Starting today, it's yours and Hannah's responsibility to find wives for the single men in Stumptown." Brian and Maverick cheered loudly. Courtney and Hannah hurried back to their husbands. Denton took her in his arms and gazed into her mesmerizing eyes, lovingly. "What's all the excitement? How would you like to help Mrs. Easton in her new calling as town's matchmaker?" Hannah squealed with delight and hugged her husband fiercely. Maverick laughed, but appeared to enjoy the show of affection. "After all," Denton continued, "we have finally found a place to call home. Let's also turn this town into our new family." Courtney smiled and sighed. "I couldn't agree more." The end. Thank you for listening to Denton's Bride. Book 1 of the Runaway Brides series. Written by Marie Higgins. Text copyright 2020 by Marie Higgins. Production copyright 2023 by Marie Higgins.